76, there are three subcommittees. Subcommittee 1 is for concepts and terminology, which is basically ISO 9000, and then subcommittee 2 is for quality management system, and subcommittee 3, SC3, oversees the supporting technologies such as ISO 19011. And here is that summary of the discussion which we had. So TC 176 is quality management and quality assurance. Out of that, subcommittee 2 is for quality system, which covers 9001 and 9004, and there are working groups under that. So I don't think you need to go into these details, but then you just need to have a quick understanding that there are committees, subcommittees, and working groups. They work on revising this standard. So currently, right now in 2024, the revision of standard is already in progress. So very soon, maybe in a year or two, we should be getting next revision of ISO 9001 standard. Now coming to the reasons of 9001 2015 revision. I know this is an old history, 9 years ago, but then these are the reasons for which this standard was revised. One thing was that the emphasis on documentation was reduced because there was a concept or a thought building up that ISO 9001 standard means lots and lots of documentation. So there was less emphasis on documentation in 2015 version. And another thing was that different standards such as 14001 or 18001, they had sort of a different structure. So they were aligned together to make a common structure for all the standards, a common language for all the standards, so that companies can go for multiple certifications, multiple management systems in the company without having too much of hassle. So there was a need to have consistency, and that consistency was achieved by high level structure. So for all these management system standards, there was a high level structure developed, which is called as Annex SL, that gave high level structure, that each of these management system standards will have 10 clauses. Clause number 1 will be this, clause number 2 will be this, and then only the relevant portion was changed for each of these standards. So a high level structure, Annex SL, was also developed, and all the standards were basically aligned so that they have a similar terminology, similar structure. And here is that high level structure of 9001. This is based on Annex SL framework. And once again, this is basically a document which basically guides that how each of these management system standards, whether this is a quality management standard or environmental management standard or any other management standard, they will have a common structure, they will have a common core clauses. And based on that, this standard 9001 2015 was developed. So this is a high level overview of the history of ISO 9001 and the revision and how these standards are changed or managed. Now with this basic introduction, we conclude this section, which was basically related to the fundamental concepts related to ISO 9001. Now with this, we will move to section 2, which will be a short section, brief section, and in which we will talk about ISO 9001 10 clauses at a very high level, so that you can have a good understanding of the overall concept of 9001 without going into too much technicalities, too much detail. That will be good for people who just need high level overview, or for people who are in the management role, they don't want to go into the detail aspect of 9001. Let's talk about that in section 2. Welcome to section 2 of this course. In section 1, we talked about some basic fundamentals related to ISO 9001 standard. We talked about concepts such as 7 quality management principles. We talked about the process approach, risk-based thinking, PDCA cycle, documented information, and we also talked about a brief history of ISO 9001 standard. Now let's come to the standard itself. And as I earlier said, that we will be discussing ISO 9001 standard at 2 levels. In this section, we will learn about this at a very high level, where I will talk about 10 clauses in ISO 9001 at a very high level. So that will give you a good overview of what this standard is. And if you are in a management position, or if you just want to learn at a high level about 9001, then this section would be good for you. And if you want to go into more detail, then section 3 will cover that. So let's come to the overview of 9001. Earlier also, we talked about this particular slide, which is on PDCA cycle. So here in ISO 9001, we have 10 clauses, and out of these 10 clauses, first 3 clauses are more of an administrative clauses. So they don't give you any requirement. Starting from clause number 4 to clause number 10, there are requirements, and this is how they fit into the PDCA cycle. So in the planning phase, we have clause number 4, which is understanding the context of the organization, and we also have clause number 6, which is planning. Clause number 5, which is leadership, is basically a central or the core clause, which basically covers all the 4 phases of the PDCA cycle. So the role of management is in planning, in doing, in checking, and in acting. Now coming to the next part of PDCA cycle, which is the do part. Do part is covered in clause number 7, which is talking about the support functions, and then clause number 8 is on the main operations, which covers that how things are getting done in the organization. So clause 8 covers the operation part, and this clause is a very big clause. A lot of details are covered in clause number 8, which is operation. Next, when we reach to the C phase of PDCA cycle, the checking part, that is covered in clause number 9, which is the performance evaluation. And clause number 10 is act part, where we are acting on whatever gap we have identified in the checking. For that, we have clause number 10, which is improvement. So here we talk about the continuous improvement part of the system. So these are the 10 clauses, a very high level overview. Now let's quickly look at these 10 clauses in slightly more detail, but still this will be a very high level overview. So what I will do is in the next video, I will be talking about clause number 1 to clause number 4, and then we will cover balance in next few videos. What is covered in this clause? This clause basically tells that ISO 9001 helps you or the organization in meeting the customer demands and the legal or the statutory and regulatory requirements. That is it. There is no requirement here which you need to implement as an organization. So that is clause number 1. Clause number 2 is normative references. So here it lists down all the references that you need along with ISO 9001. And what are these references? It is not references actually, it is reference, because there is only one standard which is referred in 9001, and that is ISO 9000. So basically it says that for implementing 9001, the reference is ISO 9000, and ISO 9000 is basically terms and definitions. So that standard 9000 explains about each term and definition which is used in 9001. That way, every company, every organization will have a common understanding of the terms which are used in 9001. Once again, there is no requirement here which a company has to implement and demonstrate. Coming to clause number 3, and this clause also does not have any requirement which a company has to implement or show the demonstration of that. Now, clause number 3 is terms and definitions, which we have already talked in clause number 2, which is ISO 9000 covers the terms and definitions. So here under clause number 3 also, it refers to ISO 9000, that for terms and definition, look at ISO 9000, and that provides terms and definitions, and these terms and definitions are for the consistency purpose, so that every organization, every person understands these terms same way. So these are the 3 clauses, and all these 3 clauses are more of an administrative clauses. None of these you need to demonstrate that how do you meet these requirements. So for that reason, any quality system basically starts with clause number 4 of ISO 9001. Let's come to clause number 4. Clause number 4 is the context of the organization. And if you remember, this clause was under the planning part in PDCA. Now, what is the context of the organization? Think this way, that you are new, your company is new, and you want to set up a quality management system. And quality management system will tell that how work is done in the organization, how checks and balances are done, how roles and responsibilities are defined, how the processes work. So all those things you need to define. And you are new to the system, and the company is also new. Now, the first thing what you will naturally do is you will try to understand what this organization is. And basically that means understanding the context of the organization. What are the challenges? What are the internal and external issues? So you want to find those. And that's what this particular clause says, that before you start thinking about implementing quality management system, think about internal and external issues, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of the company. So think about those things that will help you in defining or setting up the right quality management system for this company. Next thing what you want to do is you want to look at the needs and expectations of the interested parties. So who are the interested parties here? Your suppliers, your clients, or maybe the regulatory requirements, or your employees. So you look at what all interested parties you have and what are their needs and expectations. So you need to understand those before you start developing your quality management system. Once you have done that, the next step will be defining the scope of the QMS. Now, based on whatever information you have collected from the internal, external issues, from the needs and expectations of interested party, here you define what will be the scope of your quality management system. Which part of the organization is implementing quality management system? What are the facilities which are included, excluded? So here you define that what all you want to put into the quality management system. So this is clause number 4. So at this stage, even though you are new to the quality management system, your company is new, you understood something about the company, and you understood that what level or what extent of QMS you want to implement. That's clause number 4. Now let's talk about clause number 5, 6, and 7 in the next video. Now let's move to the next one, which is clause number 5, which is leadership. And this clause, when we saw in PDCA cycle, this was in the core. So this clause is applicable to all 4 phases of PDCA cycle. So now what do we have in leadership clause? In leadership clause, ISO requires that the companies should demonstrate leadership commitment to quality or the quality management system. So basically this emphasizes that quality management system should be established with the support and guidance and commitment of leadership. And the standard also says that the leadership will establish a quality policy which will be implemented, and they will define roles and responsibilities and authorities. So these are basically the fundamental needs or fundamental things which leadership need to do to implement the quality management system in the company. That's clause number 5. Coming to clause number 6, here we are talking about the planning, and clause number 6 is planning for the quality management system. It is not planning for the product or service which you are making, it is planning for the quality management system which you are establishing. Just going back to the example where I said that assuming that you are new to the QMS, company is new and you want to set up quality management system. So in clause number 4, you looked at the context of the organization. In clause number 5, you ensured that the leadership is committed to QMS, and now in clause number 6, you are planning for implementing the quality management system. So what you need to do is you need to look at the risks and opportunities. And we did talk about risk-based thinking in the fundamental concepts related to 9001 in section 1 of this course. So we talked about risk-based thinking there, and that's what is covered here in clause number 6, that whatever planning you are doing, whatever quality management you are implementing, that should be based on the risks and opportunities. So keep risk and opportunity in the mind. And then you need to set up quality objectives. So quality objectives are specific objectives for different functions, different departments, and these objectives should be aligned with the quality policy. And we talked about quality policy in the previous clause, which was leadership. And then you need to plan for the changes to the QMS, because QMS will change with time. Things will change. Then you need to plan that how you will change your quality management system without upsetting the whole system. So you need to have some plan that this is how the QMS will be updated. This is how the changes will be implemented. So this is the planning part for the QMS. Coming to the next clause, which is clause number 7, support. And earlier also we said that the support, which is clause number 7, and clause number 8, which is operation, they fall under the do part of PDCA cycle. Some of the aspects of support, I would say, fall under planning, but most of that falls under the do part. So it's really difficult to say whether it's a planning or do part, but let's not go into that discussion. So what do we have in support? In support, we need to have resources for doing that work, whatever you are doing in the company. Now, resources include people. So you need to have right people with the right skill to do the job. You need to have infrastructure to do the job. So let's say if you're manufacturing something, you need to have machines, you need to have factory, and then environment is another thing, that you need to have right environment to do the job. In terms of a factory, this might be the temperature, humidity. That is one part of support. Another aspect of support is organizational knowledge. So for doing anything, you need some knowledge in the organization. So whether you have the right information, right knowledge to do the job, what this company is doing. And you need to ensure that the people are competent and they are aware of what they need to do. So you might need to provide some training. You might need to provide some coaching for people to do their job properly. And then there is a need to have effective communication. So that communication protocol will be established as a part of this clause. And then it also covered controlling documented information. And we did talk about documented information in section 1, which basically consists of the documents and records. So you need to have the control on that so that the right document is available at the right place for right people to do the job. And then another part of support is monitoring and measuring resources. And if I have to put a simple word for that, that would be calibration. So you need to make sure that whatever instruments you are using for manufacturing testing, those are properly calibrated so that you are making a right decision based on the right information which you get from these gauges or any other measurement. So measurement doesn't need to be just the gauges which measure pressure, temperature. Measurement could be in many forms. For example, measuring client satisfaction, etc. So this is about the support part, which is covered in clause number 7. Now, clause number 8, which we will be talking about in the next video, covers the actual part of doing the job, which is the operations. Let's talk about that in the next video. So far, we have covered 7 clauses out of 10 clauses in ISO 9001. Now, coming to the clause number 8. So if you actually look at the standard 9001 standard, you will see that this particular clause is a very long clause which is covered on multiple pages. So there are lots and lots of requirements. So once we go into the detail in the next section, you will see that this is the longest clause in the standard. Now, operation is basically whatever you are doing. So if you are a manufacturing company making cars, that is operation for you. If you are a consulting company, or if you are a project management company, or if you are a bank, or if you are a financial institution, whatever you are doing is the operation part. And that is what is covered in this particular clause. Remember that ISO 9001 is for any type of industry, any size, any type. Many of these requirements you need to look at with the right context. How does these make sense to your type of work? Now let's briefly talk about what is covered in clause number 8, which is operation. The first part in operation is planning and controlling operational processes. So basically here we are talking about planning part. And remember that clause 6 also was planning. But clause 6 planning was the planning of quality management system. Here we are talking about planning your work, production planning, the project planning. That's what will be covered in this part, which is planning and controlling operational processes. So you might have to plan that, okay, we will be making, let's say, 1,000 cars. These are the number of pieces. These are the components which we are receiving. So all that big planning is done as a part of clause number 8, which is under operations. The next thing, what you need to do is you need to determine the product and service requirements. What do we expect from this? So basically, this is understanding the needs and expectations of the customer. In some cases, this might be simple. Customer might give you an order that they want this particular piece to be produced with this size, with this hardness. So that is one part. But at many places, let's say if you are Starbucks or any other coffee shop, your customer doesn't give you a written requirement that this is what they want. They tell you something that, okay, I want a coffee with low sugar or whatever it is. So they verbally tell you the requirement, and the person who makes coffee delivers the coffee to the customer. So there also the person has to understand what are the needs and expectations of the customer. That's what this second part is. And the third part is designing and developing products and services. So think of a company where you get requirements from the customer. You might have to do the designing and development of that. Or maybe you don't get specific requirement from the customer. You are making or you are doing a mass production. Then also you will have the designing and development of the product. This clause itself is a quite comprehensive clause which is related to design part. Here the clause talks about design input, design control, design planning, design changes, design output. So many aspects are covered in this clause. Then the next aspect which is covered in operations is controlling externally provided processes, products and services. Now what does that mean? Externally provided processes, products and services. So basically in simple word, it is talking about controlling your suppliers, because your supplier quality will be your quality. So the type of input which you get from your supplier will affect your product. So you need to control your suppliers inputs as well. That's what is covered here. This will cover things like how do you qualify your suppliers, how do you select your suppliers, how do you check the inputs from your supplier. So all those aspects have to be defined as a part of this particular clause. And then the next thing is managing product and service provision, basically actually doing the job, management of that, and then releasing product and service. So once you have done that, once you have made the car, once you have made the coffee, once you have made the check which your customer is wanting from you as a bank, then releasing that product or service, that what needs to be checked before this particular piece of a product or service is released to the customer, you need to define that here as a part of clause number 8, which is operation. And then if things are not going well as a part of releasing product or as a part of final inspection, if you find a non-conforming output, then how is that controlled? That also is needed to be defined under clause number 8. So there are lots and lots of things under clause number 8. So basically the whole operation this company is doing, your company is doing, is needed to be covered under clause number 8, which is operations. Now in the next video, we will talk about the balance 2 clauses, which are clause number 9 and 10. So previously we talked about clause number 8, which was operation, which covered everything the company does from planning to actually releasing the product to the customer. Now coming to the next clause, which is performance evaluation. So once again going back to the PDCA cycle. So D part covered clause number 7, which is a support, and clause number 8, which is operation. That was the D part. Now C part or the checking part is clause number 9, which is performance evaluation. So here you need to evaluate how are things working out. So you have done the job, but how is it working? Whether things are going right or not? Are there any gaps between what is expected and what is actually happening? That's what is covered in performance evaluation. So here you need to define the monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation of your quality management system performance. How is your quality management system performing? What is the defect rate? What are the customer complaints? What are other factors which you need to consider, which tell that how is your quality management system working? That's what you will be doing as a part of clause number 9. Clause number 9 also includes conducting internal audits, because that is also one of the way to look at how things are working out. So you define your system. Now you are implementing that system. Somebody in your organization has to look at that. How is that working? Whether people are implementing the system which you have developed, are there any gaps? Is there any possibility of making change to improve the performance? So all those things are covered as a part of internal audits. And here we are talking about internal audits and not the external audit done by 9001 certification body auditors. That's not covered here. ISO is not talking about that. ISO standard is only talking about the internal audits which you need to do as a part of implementing quality management system. And you need to take actions on all the audit findings which you get as a result of these audits. And another important aspect in performance evaluation is the management review. So standard also expects that management will review the performance of the quality management system periodically. So typically what I've seen is once a year, the company management will sit with the quality manager, quality director, and look at all the quality performance indicators, how things are going, what are the customer complaints and other things. And obviously it's not that management will look at the customer complaints once in a year, but this once in a year thing is to review the overall performance of the quality management system. And based on that, some decisions are taken by management. And this is the clause which also shows the commitment of management towards the quality management system. As a part of this review, there will be some actions which will be identified. So those actions are needed to be taken. Management might need to commit to some resources. That also is done during the management review. So this is clause number 9, which is basically looking at the performance, identifying the gaps and taking actions on that. Coming to the last clause, which is clause number 10, which is improvement, and which is basically ACT part of PDCA cycle. Now here in the improvement part, you identify the improvement opportunities. Some of those might come from the management review, some of those might come from the audit. So all those opportunities are identified, actions are taken. And here standard also talks about managing non-conformities and corrective actions. So if there is a non-conformity, let's say things are not going as planned, there is a gap between what is expected and what is actually there. The first thing which you might want to do is do the correction. Take action to correct that gap. That is correction part, to address the non-conformity. But then in addition to that, you would also need to take corrective actions. And corrective actions are those actions which are taken so that the problem is resolved permanently. So if you have a problem, one is correcting that, second is doing the root cause analysis, let's say, and finding out the real reason of that, taking action on that to make sure that this problem does not happen again. This is called as corrective action. So that is also covered in this clause. Earlier, prior to 2015, there used to be a clause related to preventive actions as well, but after 2015 or in 2015 standard, that clause is no more there. The preventive action clause has been removed, and many people have confusion between corrective action and preventive action. It is the corrective action which you take to make sure that the problem does not happen again. And then this clause also talks about promoting continual improvement of the quality management system, which is again a role of management to promote people, to suggest some ideas, make some changes to the quality management system, which will improve it over a period of time. So these are the 10 clauses in ISO 9001. And once again, as we earlier said, this is a very high level, a very superficial level introduction to the requirement. But this would give you a good idea about the overall structure of the standard. In the next section, we will go clause by clause in a little bit more detail and understand the ISO 9001 standard in more depth. Let's do that in the next section. Welcome to section 3 of this course. Previously in section 1, we talked about some basic fundamental concepts related to ISO 9001. Then in section 2, we had a quick overview of ISO 9001 standard where we looked at the main 10 clauses at a very high level, just to give you an overview of ISO 9001 standard. For some people who are in management role or people who do not want to go into the details of 9001, section 2 would have been sufficient to get some knowledge about ISO 9001 standard. But for people who want to learn more about 9001, go into the details of this, look at how do companies implement that. For that, we have section 3, where we will be covering all the requirements, sub-requirements in more detail. So my attempt would be to keep things simple and give some examples so that these concepts or these clauses are clear to you. So with this basic introduction and the objective of section 3, now let's move on to the next video and talk about clause number 1 of the standard, which is scope. So now coming to the clause 1 of ISO 9001:2015, and that is scope. So here in this clause, ISO 9001 explains what is the scope of this standard. The very first thing what you need to understand is that this particular standard 9001 is a generic standard, and when I say generic, it means it can be applied to any type of organization, any size of organization. Whether you are a company with, let's say, 2-3 people, or you are a company with 100,000 people, ISO 9000 can be applied in all type of situations. Another thing which I want to highlight here is that ISO 9001 standard is for the company. It is not for the product. Your product is not certified to 9001. The company gets certified to 9001. So ISO 9001 is used by companies to demonstrate that they can consistently meet the requirements of customer, and they can provide the product or service consistently meeting all the customer and regulatory needs. That is the purpose of ISO 9001. And the companies who are implementing 9001 and getting certified to 9001 provide confidence to the customer that these companies meet the requirements of the customer and legal requirements. And once again, this is about the company and not about the product which this company is making. So this is the first clause, which is the scope clause. Just like I previously explained, clause number 1, 2 and 3 are more of an administrative clauses. They do not pose any requirement on the company. So companies really do not need to have a plan to implement clause number 1, 2 and 3. These are just the introductory clauses. So this is clause number 1, scope. Now let's move to the next clause in the next video, which is normative references. Now coming to the second clause of 9001 standard, clause number 2, which is normative references. Before we talk about this clause, normative references, let's first understand what does this mean when I say normative references. I understand that when I have a book, so let's say this is the book I have in my hand, and at the end of this book there are references. So let's look at that. So here I can see that there is a page or 2 or 3 pages of references here. Basically, this tells that for writing this book, these are the places where the reference was taken from. That's the references. But then what is normative references? Normative references are those references which are mandatory for this particular standard to be understood. So for using this particular standard, you must use these normative references. Unlike whatever you saw in this book. In this book, when you saw maybe 3 or 4 pages of references, it does not say that you need to read all these books before you read this particular book. Whereas when it says normative references, it means that this particular reference is indispensable or must be referred along with the standard. That's fine. Now we understand what is normative references, but what is listed in this? What are the references? It refers to only one standard, which is ISO 9000:2015. And 9000 is the standard which gives the definitions and fundamentals related to quality management system. So whatever terms have been used in 9001, to understand the definition of that, to understand the meaning of that, you should be referring ISO 9000. So this will ensure that all the organization, all the users of 9001 standard look at each of these terms consistently. People should not be thinking these terms in a different way, and for that you need to use ISO 9000 standard for terms and definitions. So this is clause number 2, which basically refers to ISO 9000 as a normative reference. So after talking about clause number 2, which was normative references, now let's move on to the clause number 3 of the standard, which is terms and definitions. In terms and definition, the standard lists down ISO 9000 2015 for comprehensive understanding of definitions and explanation. So here in this clause also, ISO 9001 refers to ISO 9000 for terms and definitions. Personally to me, clause number 2 and clause number 3 are basically more of a similar thing for ISO 9001. It might be different for some other standard, but here in 9001, clause number 2, which is normative references, and clause number 3, which is terms and definitions, both of these clauses actually refer you to go and look at ISO 9000 2015, which gives you the terms and definitions, and which is also the normative reference for ISO 9001 standard. Now here are some of the terms and definitions which I have listed down from ISO 9000. So in ISO 9000, quality is defined as the degree to which a set of inherent characteristics of an object fulfills requirements. That's the quality. The process, which is defined as a set of interrelated or interacting activities that use inputs to deliver an intended result. And when I say intended result, or when the standard says intended result, this could mean the output, the product, or the service which is being produced, depending on the context. So this is process, and we did talk about process approach in the first section where we looked at some basic concepts. The customer is defined as a person or the organization that could or does receive a product or service that is intended for or required by this person or organization. But then there are many definitions in 9000 standard which you should refer to when you have doubt or when you need to understand what specifically this particular term means. So ISO 9000 standard should be used along with 9001 to understand the terms and definitions. So this is clause number 3. In clause number 1, 2 and 3, there are no specific requirements which companies need to implement. These are more of an administrative clauses, as I previously said. Now, once we go to clause number 4, which we start from the next video, there we will have requirements which companies need to implement. Understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. So each organization will have some interested parties. For example, the employees, the management, the customer, the supplier, the regulators, the shareholders. These are the interested parties. And as a part of implementing quality management system, you need to understand who these interested parties are and what are their needs and expectations. By understanding them, you can meet them properly. You can meet these requirements or these expectations properly. That is clause number 4.2. Now coming to the implementation part of 4.2. So for that, basically, you might need to list down all the stakeholders, and you might want to list down what are their needs and expectations. You might want to do survey. You might want to talk to them. You might do some other way to find out that what are the needs and expectations of these stakeholders. And then you might need to prioritize them based on the impact they will have on the quality management system. And accordingly, you will develop your quality management system to meet these needs and expectations. So these are 4.1 and 4.2. Now in the next video, we will talk about clause number 4.3 and 4.4. Clause number 4.3 is determining the scope of the quality management system. What you have done earlier in 4.1 is you understood the context of the organization. In 4.2, you understood the needs and expectations of interested parties. Now you need to determine the scope of the quality management system. So here you want to define the boundaries and applicability of the quality management system. That these are the areas which will be included in the QMS, and these are the areas which will be excluded from the QMS. And this you decide based on the internal and external issues which you have identified as a part of context of the organization, and also the needs and expectations of the interested parties. So based on that, you define the scope of the quality management system. And you need to document the scope of the quality management system. So earlier also, when we were talking about the documented information, we did talk about maintaining documented information and retaining documented information. Maintaining documented information was to make a document and maintain that. Retaining documented information was basically a record of implementation. Here the standard is talking about maintaining the documented information. That means this information you need to keep as a document, and the scope statement of the quality management system should include what are the types of products and services which are covered by this quality management system, and you need to apply all the requirements of this standard, 9001 standard, which are applicable for the scope which you have determined. So this was about determining the scope of the QMS, which is clause number 4.3. Now coming to the key actions which you need to take to meet clause number 4.3 requirements. So first thing is that the scope, whatever you determine, should be based on the context of the organizations, should meet the needs and expectations of the interested parties, and should align with the strategic direction or the goal of the company. And this particular scope needs to be kept as a document in some form or shape. This should be documented that this is the scope of your quality management system. And this becomes an auditable document. So that means anywhere when it says maintain documented information, so next time when you have an external audit by ISO 9001 auditor, the auditor would or might ask you to show you a document where you have listed down the scope of your quality management system. This was clause number 4.3. Now coming to clause 4.4, which is quality management system and its processes. Now this is a very general clause which basically tells that what all you need to do to put your quality management system in place. So for example, it says establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the quality management system, including the processes needed and their interactions, determine the inputs and outputs, determine the sequence of operations, methods, controls, resources. So basically this clause asks you to list down or write down the processes which this company or this organization will be following. And it also talks about addressing the risks and opportunities, which we will be covering in clause 6.1 later. And it also talks about changes to the QMS and improving the QMS. So all those aspects are listed in 4.4. So in summary, what 4.4 is asking you is to set up your quality management system, list down all the processes, inputs, outputs, controls, etc. Now, what are the key actions for clause number 4.4? Basically, what you need to do here is you need to map down all your key processes. You need to identify what are the inputs, what are the outputs, what are the interdependency between these processes. Basically, this asks you to set up your quality management system, and you need to assign who are the process owners, what are the roles and responsibilities. You need to implement the risk management approach to address the challenges which you might face when you are implementing these processes. So all that thing you need to maintain as a documented information. So basically, it asks you to document all the processes. That is the maintain documented information. But in addition to maintain documented information, this clause, which is 4.4, also asks you to retain documented information to give the confidence that whatever processes you have defined, you are implementing them as planned. So basically, this is a broad clause which basically tells you to set up your quality management system, maintain the documented evidence of that this is our quality management system. These are the key processes which we are following. These are the inputs, outputs, roles and responsibilities, and you need to keep the record of implementing that. Once again, this is a very broad clause. It doesn't specifically ask you about anything. So this is sort of an umbrella clause asking you to put QMS in place and implement that. So with this, we complete clause number 4, which was about understanding the context of the organization. Now with this, now let's move on to the clause number 5, which is leadership. ISO 9001 standard gets revised almost after 6 or 7 years. So if you have seen the history, this was first introduced in 1987, then this was revised in 1994, then in 2000, and the fourth edition was in 2008, and the fifth edition was in 2015. So you would see that this gets revised every 6, 7 or 8 years. So somewhere around 2020 or 2021, when this was a time to revise the standard, the voting was done and the member of the committee favored in not revising the standard. But later in 2024, an amendment was added to the standard, and this was the first time in the history of ISO 9001 that a formal amendment was added to the standard. This amendment 1, which was introduced in 2024, it added requirements related to the climate change in the context of the organization. So in clause 4.1 and 4.2, requirements related to the climate change have been added. The intention was to integrate the climate change considerations into the quality management system to enhance the sustainability part of the organization. Now let's look at the changes which were made in this amendment. Now here are the exact wordings of the amendment. This amendment is not a long amendment, just 2 sentences have been added. In 4.1, which is understanding the organization and its context, one sentence which has been added is that the organization shall determine whether climate change is a relevant issue. So what we were doing in 4.1 was we were looking at the context of the organization. We were looking at the internal and external factors which could affect this organization. Now in those factors, a specific factor which is climate change has been added. So it requires that when the context of the organization is reviewed, look at the climate change aspect as well. And the second change was in clause number 4.2, which is understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. Here a note was added, and the note says that the relevant interested parties can have requirements related to climate change. So look at those requirements as well. So this is in a way a simple change, but let's see that how does this get implemented and have a better understanding of this change. Now, when it comes to integrating climate change considerations into the quality management systems, so what I've done is I have split that into a number of steps. One thing is that we need to understand or identify the relevant factors. So when you are looking at the internal and external factors, look at the climate change factors which could affect your organization. And also look at the needs and expectations of interested parties related to the climate change impact. So this was related to identifying these factors. Then what next you might want to do is you might want to incorporate these into the planning part, and for that you might look into the risks and opportunities which you have identified and add these factors into your risks and opportunities as well. And as a part of planning, set some objectives, set some targets related to the climate change factors which you have identified and which you thought to adopt in your organization. And then when it comes to implementing, look at your operational processes and see that where you can reduce the impact on climate change, where you can reduce the carbon footprint and all the factors which you can implement to enhance the environmental sustainability. So consider these things into your work processes, what you are doing, and implement environmental friendly practices and technologies. So earlier when we talked about interested parties and their interest in climate change factors, here are some of the examples which you might want to consider. For example, when it comes to your customer requirements might be eco-friendly packaging and reduced carbon footprint. Earlier, Amazon used to give all the packages in big boxes. So even if the item was this small, the box will be this big and the small item will be in that. People objected to that because that was wastage of resources and that was not environmental friendly. So that is one thing where the customer requirements led to the change in the organization. Another one or the another interested party could be your regulatory authorities, their requirements. So regulatory authorities requirements could include compliance to some emission regulations or reporting standards. So those also need to be considered in your quality management system. The investors of the organization might want disclosure on the climate risks and sustainability performance. And in today's world, employees also prefer to work with companies who are environmental friendly companies who look at the climate change factors and implement sustainable practices. So employees also prefer those companies which focus on environmental factors. And another one is obviously community requirements. The local community also would prefer to have companies in their neighborhood who are environmental friendly. So these are some of the examples of climate change requirements emphasized by interested parties. You might have different depending on your product or service. So look into that, look into your interested parties and what are their needs and expectations related to the climate change. Now, just to wrap up the amendment 1, here are the key actions which you might want to take. It's a simple statement that ensure that climate related requirements are considered in the quality management system of the organization. So with this, we complete this portion where we looked at the amendment 1 which was issued in 2024 to the ISO 9001:2015 version. Previously, we covered clause number 4 of ISO 9001 standard, which was the context of the organization. Now coming to the next clause, which is clause number 5, leadership. So now going back to the PDCA cycle, which we have been talking continuously throughout this course. PDCA is plan, do, check, and act. Where does leadership fit into this? Is it a part of P, planning, doing, checking, or acting? Basically, this is a part of all the 4 parts of PDCA cycle, and that's the reason ISO put this as the central core of the PDCA cycle. So the leadership role is applicable to the planning, for doing, for checking, and for acting. ISO 9001:2015 heavily focuses on the role of leadership in implementing QMS. They expect a lot from leadership. In the prior versions of ISO 9001, that means prior to 2015 version, for example 2000 version or 2008 version, there was a requirement to have a management representative. Now that requirement related to management representative has been removed in 2015. Instead, what this standard now focuses on is that leadership should play a central role rather than having a management representative doing that role. So the role of leadership has increased in 2015 version onwards. And when we talk about leadership, which is clause number 5, there are 3 sub clauses in this. One is related to leadership commitment, which is 5.1. And the next one, which is 5.2, is related to quality policy. And the third one, which is 5.3, is related to the organization's role and responsibilities. In this video, we will just focus on the first one, which is 5.1, the leadership commitment. And then in the second video, we will cover the balance 2 sub clauses. Now let's come to 5.1, which is leadership and commitment. In leadership and commitment clause, again there are 2 sub clauses, 5.1.1 and 5.1.2. 5.1.1 is the general clause related to leadership and commitment. Now what do we have in this? Basically, this is a general clause which says that leadership should play a central role in establishing and implementing quality management system. They should be accountable for the effectiveness of QMS. And when I say accountable, that means the buck stops there. Management needs to establish the quality policy and quality objective, and we will be talking about quality policy in the next subclause, which is 5.2. And another thing is that QMS should be the integral part of the business processes. When you say quality management system, it should be basically the management system of the company. So you cannot have the way you do processes and the way you manage quality. It is basically the same thing. So it is also the responsibility of leadership to make sure that the business processes and the quality management systems are integrated, and these are based on the risk-based thinking and the use process approach. We did talk about the process approach and risk-based thinking earlier in the basic conceptual or the fundamental concepts. Management needs to provide resources for QMS, and they clearly need to communicate the importance of the quality management system to the members of the organization. And they need to make sure that the quality management system which is implemented achieves the intended result. So result also should be in the focus. Engagement is another aspect of leadership and commitment, which says that engaging and directing people to contribute to the QMS effectiveness. And once again, that's the role of management, to make sure that the people or the members of the organizations are engaged in implementing and improving quality management system. Management also needs to make sure that there is an environment of continuous improvement. So management should encourage continuous improvement of the quality management system, and the leadership should support the management roles in the organization. So basically, in summary, if you see here, the role of the leadership is to support, encourage, implement, and continually improve the quality management system. So once again, this is a general clause. It does not specifically ask for something to be demonstrated, but this is something which is foundational when it comes to implementing quality management system, that leadership should play a central role in that. So this is 5.1.1, which is a general clause. Next sub clause, which is 5.1.2, is the customer focus. So the leadership should make sure that the customer focus is central to the quality management system, and they are meeting the needs and expectations of the customer and meeting statutory and regulatory requirements. So these requirements are determined, understood, and consistently met. That is the role of leadership, to focus on the customer. And when determining and understanding the needs of the customers and the legal needs, the risk and opportunities need to be kept in mind. because here also we need to take action based on the risks and opportunities. So maintaining a focus on enhancing customer satisfaction is another key aspect of leadership. So after understanding the requirements of clause number 5.1, which is leadership and commitment, now let's look at some of the key actions which are needed to be taken to implement this requirement, which is the leadership and commitment. First thing is that leadership should actively participate in quality management system related activities and the improvement process. It is not something which they can delegate to, let's say, quality manager and forget about that. Leadership should play a key role or the central role in implementing quality management system. And the customer needs and expectations, or the customer requirements and the legal requirements, should be the central to the planning and operation of the quality management system. So you need to find out what customer needs, what are the legal requirements, and implement those. That's the requirement of the standard in clause number 5.1. And the leadership also should make a culture, foster a culture where the customer satisfaction is the central to whatever this organization is doing. That will help in making sure to achieve customer satisfaction. So this is clause number 5.1, which is leadership and commitment. In clause number 5, which is leadership, there are two more sub clauses, 5.2 and 5.3. Let's talk about them in the next video. In the clause related to leadership, previously we talked about leadership and commitment, which was clause number 5.1. 5.2 is quality policy. Before I talk about quality policy, let me be clear that whatever you are seeing on this slide is not the direct reproduction from the standard. I tried to reword them in such a way and restructure them so that these are easy to understand and easy to implement. So that is something which I wanted to clarify. So when you look at these bullet points are not exactly what you see in the standard, but these bullet points explain clearly what is written in the standard. Now coming back to our topic, which is clause number 5.2, quality policy. So when it comes to quality policy, there are three aspects of this: establishing quality policy, the contents of that, and the communication of the quality policy. So the top management or leadership should establish a quality policy. That is a requirement and that needs to be documented. So they need to have a documented quality policy in place, that this is our quality policy, and this quality policy should be based on the strategic directions and the goal of the organizations. Now what is included in the quality policy? Quality policy should basically demonstrate that this company or this organization wants to meet customer requirements. They want to meet applicable legal, statutory, regulatory requirement. The organization wants to continually improve their quality management system. And this should also become the framework for quality objectives. So here we are putting a quality policy. Later on, we will talk about quality objectives as well, which are based on this quality policy. So this is what quality policy should contain, and this quality policy should be clearly communicated to the people in the organization. And people should clearly understand and apply this quality policy in the organization. So these are the requirements related to quality policy in clause number 5.2. Now coming to how do we implement that? So there are key actions related to implementation. First is that the organization need to develop a quality policy, and we have already talked on the previous slide that what this quality policy should cover, and this should be clearly communicated to people in the organization so that they can understand and implement that. And this is a documented information. So this was clause number 5.2, which is quality policy. Now coming to sub clause 5.3, which is part of leadership, clause number 5. So 5.3 is related to organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. As you could very well appreciate that when you have an organization with multiple people, you need to have clear roles and responsibilities defined so that everyone knows that what others are doing. So there is no duplication of effort and there are less conflict. And that's how the system works. And that is what is required as a part of clause number 5.3, that leadership should ensure that the roles and responsibilities are defined, communicated, and well understood within the organization. And when they are assigning roles and responsibilities, few things needed to be considered in ISO 9001. And these are that these roles and responsibilities, when you are establishing, they should ensure that the quality management system conforms to the ISO 9001 requirements. And these roles and responsibilities should also ensure that the processes are delivering the intended output. And in these roles and responsibilities, there should be people responsible for maintaining and implementing quality management system and ensuring to find out the opportunities for improvement and implementing them. And these assigned roles and responsibilities should promote the customer focus in the organization, and they should ensure that the quality management system integrity is managed, and any change to the quality management system is a planned change and it is implemented properly. There should be somebody looking at these aspects of the roles and responsibilities in addition to the routine work they are doing. Now here are the key actions related to clause number 5.3, which is the roles and responsibilities and authorities. Maybe it's a simple way to implement that is to have an organizational chart, have a clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and make sure that whatever roles and responsibilities the standard specifically has asked for, those are assigned to people. And you need to document and communicate these roles and responsibilities so that everyone in the organization is aware of these roles, responsibilities, and authorities. So this was clause number 5.3, and this completes our discussion on clause number 5, which was leadership. Now clause number 6 is on planning. Let's talk about that in the next video. Previously, in clause number 5, we talked about the role of leadership in implementing quality management system. Now coming to the clause number 6, which is planning. So if I go back to the PDCA cycle, which we have been discussing, obviously the planning clause will fall under the plan part of PDCA cycle. Now remember that when we are talking of planning here, this is the planning of the quality management system. This is not related to the production planning or the service planning or the product or service which you are producing. Here we are talking about planning related to the quality management system which you want to establish. Now in planning there are three sub clauses. 6.1, which is actions to address risks and opportunities, or the risk-based thinking. That is something which we will be covering in this video. And then 6.2 is related to quality objectives. We did talk about quality objectives when we were talking about quality policy earlier. That is clause number 6.2. We will talk about 6.2 and 6.3 in the next video. And 6.3 is planning for changes to the quality management system. So let's just focus on clause number 6.1 in this video. And 6.1 is actions to address risks and opportunities. Before I talk further about this, let's understand that the risk is outcome of uncertainty. If you know something is going to happen, then it is not a risk. Risk is related to uncertainty. Now, uncertainty could result in something positive, which we call here as risk, or that uncertainty could lead to something positive also. That is called as opportunities. So that is the difference between risk and opportunity. Risk is basically a negative risk, a harmful risk, and opportunity you can call them as the positive risk or the helpful risk. So what you want to do as an organization or even as a person, you want to minimize or reduce negative risks, and you want to take the best advantage of the positive risks or the positive uncertainties, which are opportunities. So you want to take benefit of that. Now clause number 6.1 asks for understanding the risks and opportunities. So as a part of requirement here, companies need to determine risk and opportunities, and something which we have done earlier as well in clause number 4, where we were looking at the context of the organization. We were looking at the strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat. Similarly, we are looking at what are the risks and what are the opportunities related to the work which this company is doing. That needs to be determined. That will help in ensuring that the quality management system will give the intended outcome. Now, once you have determined those risks and opportunities, you need to take some actions on that, and these actions will help you in reducing or minimizing the impact of risks and helping you to increase or enhance the outcome of the opportunities or the positive risk. And that will help you in continually improving the product or service which you are producing as a company. Now, the actions required here are plan actions to address risks and opportunities. So whatever risks and opportunities you have determined, you need to plan actions for that, and you need to integrate and implement these actions into the quality management system processes. So once you have determined that these are the risks and you have decided these are the actions, then those actions should be part of your quality management system. And then you need to evaluate what is the effectiveness of these actions. So these are the requirements related to clause number 6.1, which is actions to address risks and opportunities. Let's talk about some key actions which companies need to take when they are implementing 6.1, which is addressing risks and opportunities. So the first thing is obviously you need to find out the risks and opportunities. So you need to conduct an assessment session to find out that what are the potential risks and opportunities. And once again, I emphasize on the word potential, because risks and opportunities are related to uncertainties. You don't know whether these will happen or might not happen. And then based on that, you develop an implementation plan to mitigate risk and capitalize or take best use of opportunities. And you need to regularly review and update this risk management strategy. So before we conclude 6.1, I just want you to think, what are the risks and opportunities related to the work which you are doing? Risk is something negative. Let's say your supplier might go bankrupt. Your currency exchange rate might harm your company. Let's say the US dollar goes up or down in whatever way it harms your company. That could be a risk. Risk could be, let's say, the price of your input material goes up. A risk could be, let's say, a failure in the machine. Risk could be, let's say, non-availability of people which you want, the skill which this company wants. These are some of the risks, for example, which you might want to consider. Opportunities are something positive. Let's say some government rule and regulation might help your company. Some external event might help your company. For example, when COVID came, a lot of companies got benefit from that external event. For example, the companies which were making masks, which were making respirators, which were making online courses because people wanted to do things online, the video conferencing companies, a lot of companies got benefit out of that. So that negative event, which was COVID-19, was basically an opportunity for many of these companies. So these companies took the best advantage of that opportunity. Another examples of opportunities could be, let's say, a sharp drop in your input material, or let's say your competitor gets out of business. There could be a number of things which could be considered as opportunities. So you need to look at your business and see that what are the risks and opportunities. So maybe as a part of exercise, you might want to list down that related to your business, what could be risks and opportunities which could help your business or which could harm your organization. So this is clause number 6.1. In the next video, we will talk about 6.2 and 6.3. So in clause number 6, which is planning, previously we talked about 6.1, which was on actions to address risks and opportunities. Now coming to 6.2, which is quality objectives and planning to achieve them. So previously when we talked about quality policy, we did talk about quality objectives. So now let's look at what are the requirements related to quality objectives in ISO 9001. The first thing is the organization needs to set up quality objectives, and these objectives should be relevant to the function, level and processes. So whatever job you're doing, whatever function is being done, these quality objectives should be related to that. And then these objectives should be consistent with the quality policy, and these objectives should be measurable. Rather, these should be SMART objectives. And when we say SMART, S is for specific. So your objective should be specific, that in this production line, we want to reduce the defect rate from the current level of 1.0 to 0.7 by the end of this year. That's how your quality objective should be. It should be specific, it should be measurable, it should be achievable, it should be realistic, and it should be time bound. So SMART objective should have all these 5 characteristics. And these quality objectives should be based on the requirements which this company is expected to follow based on the customer needs and the legal needs. And they should help in improving the service and increasing the customer satisfaction. And you need to monitor, communicate, and update these quality objectives as appropriate. There's no point of making quality objectives and not measuring them. And then there is no point of measuring them if you are not taking action on that. So you define quality objectives, you monitor them, measure them, communicate them, and update them as necessary. So it's not something that you decided that we will reduce the defect rate from 1.0 to 0.7. Probably you might have to change that later on. You might have to increase or decrease depending on whatever scenario is there, whatever circumstances are there. But when you plan for quality objectives, you need to consider that you need some resources for that. Let's say when I say that for this production line, we will reduce the defect rate from 1.0 to 0.7 by the end of year. You need some resources for that. You might need some new equipment. You might need some training for people who are doing that job. So that also need to be considered. And I'm talking about resources. And then you need to define the responsible parties, the timeline, and how these results will be evaluated. So these are the aspects related to quality objective. And this is also one of the requirements where the company is expected to maintain documented information. So you need to list down that what are your objectives, and you maintain that documented information as a part of your quality management system. Now coming to the key actions, and obviously we have already talked about many of these key actions that you need to set up your quality objectives. These quality objectives should be aligned with the company's goal and the quality policy, and make sure that these objectives are SMART, which are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And then after setting up these quality objectives, you need to monitor the progress and make adjustment to make sure that you achieve the objective. So this is clause number 6.2, which is related to setting up, maintaining, and monitoring quality objectives. Coming to clause number 6.3, which is planning of changes. So let's say you set up a quality management process, you set up roles and responsibilities, you set up your processes, made a flow chart that this is the input, this is the process, that's the output. But things change. Technology change, people change, companies' objectives change. So you need to change your quality management system based on these circumstances. So you need to determine that when you need to make any change, you need to determine the need of that, and then you need to make those changes in a planned and systematic way. So when making changes to the quality management system, you should be clear of the purpose, that why you are making this change and what is the implication of that. What are the potential consequences of that? We have already talked that many processes in the organizations are not straight line. There are many interactions from other disciplines. So you need to consider those as well, that making a change here could affect many other functions, many other processes as well. So that also needs to be considered. And when making changes, you need to make sure that the integrity of the quality management system is maintained. Once again, quality management system in many companies could be quite complex, which is integrating many different disciplines and departments. So changing one place could lead to many other changes that needs to be considered. And when making changes, you need some resources for that. Let's say if you make a change to the process, you need to update the documentation, you need to train people, you need to monitor that the new process is being followed, and for that you might need some extra resources. That also needs to be considered when you're making changes to the quality management system. And the roles and responsibilities also need to be updated based on the changes. So this is what clause number 6.3 is talking about, which is planning of changes. Coming to the key actions which you might need for clause number 6.3 implementation. One thing is that change needs to be planned and systematically done, and for that you might want to use a change management process, and those changes need to be communicated to all stakeholders, and you need to monitor the effectiveness of those changes. If that change is not giving the desired result, then you might need to make some adjustment. That also you should be considering, and in all that process, your quality management system integrity should be maintained. So this is clause number 6.3, and once again here we are talking about changes related to the quality management system. We will be covering later on in clause number 8 changes related to, let's say, design and development, changes related to the production. So those aspects related to operational changes will be covered in clause number 8. But in 6.3 here we are only talking about changes related to the quality management system. So this completes our discussion on clause number 6, which is planning. Previously, in clause number 6, we talked about planning. And in PDCA cycle, planning was under the plan phase. Now coming to the do phase in PDCA cycle, do phase contains two clauses of ISO 9001. Clause number 7, which is support, and clause number 8, which is operation. Right now, we are talking about clause number 7, which is support. In clause number 7, there are 5 sub-clauses, 7.1 to 7.5, and these contain resources, which we will be covering in 7.1 in this video, and then 7.2 is competence of people, 7.3 is awareness, 7.4 will be on communication. So these 3 clauses we will be covering in the next video, and later on in the third video we will be talking about documented information, which is clause number 7.5. So with this introduction, let's move on to 7.1, which is resources. Now in resources also there are various resources. For example, people, infrastructure, environment, monitoring and measuring, organizational knowledge. So these are sub clauses of 7.1. The first one is 7.1.1, which is general. In general, the standard says that the organization shall determine and provide resources needed for the proper implementation of quality management system and its continuous improvement. Simple terms, management will provide resources. And here we are talking about internal and external resources. Internal resources will be people in the organization, knowledge of that organization, environment in that organization. And when it comes to external resources, that will be suppliers, for example. That is clause number 7.1. In simple terms, management or leadership will provide resources for doing the job. Now coming to the actual resources, 7.1.2 talks about people. Here organization is required to provide sufficient people to do the job. Sufficient people and competent people to do the job and to implement the quality management system so that the company is able to achieve its objectives. That's quite simple. To do the job, you need people, and the organization should provide necessary and competent people to do the job. Coming to the next part of 7.1 resources, the next resource is infrastructure. So in addition to people, we need infrastructure as well. Infrastructure such as the building, the machinery, the workspace, the utilities such as water, power, electricity, and equipment to do the job, and supporting service such as IT. So you need all that infrastructure to do the job, and leadership is expected to provide that. The next resource listed here is environment for operation of processes. So you need the right environment to do the job. Now, when we talk of environment, the environment could be the physical environment, such as the heat level or the humidity level. You don't expect people to do good job when it's very hot inside where people are doing job, or very humid. So that needs to be controlled where people can comfortably do the job. Another type of environment would be the social environment. For example, the culture of the company is non-discriminatory. That is the social environment. And then in addition to that, in environment, there is a psychological environment. So in psychological environment, we are talking about the freedom of people from the fear. They are able to express their opinion. There is a burnout prevention plan, etc. So these are the things which are considered as a part of environment. So once again, to repeat that, here we are talking about 3 types of environment: the physical, the social, and the psychological environment. That is another type of resource which is needed to do the job. Coming to the next part here, which is monitoring and measuring resources. Now, whatever job you're doing, you need to have some measuring and monitoring devices. For example, pressure gauges or tape or any other measurement devices. So these devices are also considered as resource in ISO 9001. So these also needed to be provided so that you can check the conformity to the requirement. So let's say if you have to check the length of a piece, then you need a tape or the vernier caliper or the gauge. And if you have to check pressure, then you need pressure gauge. If you need to check temperature, then you need thermometer. So these are the type of gauges which you need, and that is also a resource. Now here we have a little bit more detail when it comes to the measuring and monitoring resources. So when we talk of gauges, we just don't need any gauge. We need a proper gauge, a calibrated gauge, which will give us the right value. Otherwise, what is the point of having a gauge if you cannot rely on that gauge? So there are requirements related to measuring and monitoring resources, and here are some of these. So now we are going too deep into that. Now this is 7.1.5.1. So 7.1 is resources, 7.1.5 is monitoring and measuring resources, and the next point 1 represents the general clause. So in the general clause, what we have is that the organization need to determine and provide resources. So here we are talking about monitoring and measuring devices. So company need to determine that what is needed, and they need to provide those resources. These equipment or these measuring and monitoring devices shall be suitable for the activity which they are doing, and they should be accurate and reliable in measurement. Of course, that's what you want. If you are measuring temperature, you need a thermometer which is accurate, which is reliable, which is appropriate for the type of temperature measurement you are taking. Then these devices need to be maintained so that they are good for use, and then they need to be regularly checked and maintained. And then the organization is required to retain appropriate documented information. So here when I say retain documented information, basically here you are looking at some checklist, some sheet on which you are recording the data. Basically it's talking about a record. So a record needs to be kept as a evidence of fitness for purpose. Now let's say if you are using a thermometer, what will be the type of document, appropriate document, which will tell that this is fit for use? Obviously the answer is the calibration record of that particular equipment. So whatever type of equipment you are using, you need to have some calibration record of that. So this is about one piece of equipment, let's say one thermometer which you are using. So you need to have a calibration record of that. But generally, companies will have, let's say, 10 such equipment or 50 types of equipment which they are using for measuring and monitoring. So what they are required to do is they need to have a log in which they will list down all the equipment, what they have, what is the status of their calibration, when is the calibration due next time. Let's say generally every year a piece of equipment need to be calibrated, then they will have the equipment number, when the equipment was calibrated, what is the status of calibration, when is the next calibration due. That log is also maintained along with the calibration report. So there are a number of things which are needed for measuring and monitoring devices. And this is talking about measurement traceability. And here it is giving more detail because the previous clause was a general clause. Here it is giving specific requirements that you need to have calibration and verification. So the equipment which you are using should be calibrated at a specified interval before you use it. And for example, I said that a company might decide that this thermometer or this torque wrench or this pressure gauge need to be calibrated every year. So they need to decide based on the type of equipment and based on the use of that equipment. So they define the calibration interval, and based on that, these equipment are repeatedly calibrated and record is kept. But when you are calibrating an equipment, so what you do in calibration, you take a good equipment, a reliable equipment, and you take this particular equipment which you want to calibrate, and then you check the reading for both. So let's say this is a good equipment, I check pressure with this, then at the same place, I check pressure with my equipment which I want to calibrate. So I will take the reading that when the pressure is 50 on the ideal equipment, what is the reading at the equipment which is being calibrated. So if that is also 50, that's good. But then there is some margin as well. Let's say if it is 50.1, you note down that the right reading is 50, the calibrated reading is 50, but our equipment is showing 50.1. And when the master equipment is showing 100 psi, the rating or the pressure on the equipment being calibrated is, let's say, 100.2 and so on. So that is how the calibration is done. But then your ideal or the master equipment should be traceable to national or international standard. So there is a chain of calibration, but your master equipment should be aligned with the national or international standard equipment. But in case there is no such standard equipment available, then you need to document that how this calibration was done, and that information should be retained as documented information. Another important clause is related to identification and status. So measuring equipment must be identified so that you can find out the calibration status. Let's assume that you have 5 pressure gauges all in the same range. But then how do you know that which particular equipment is calibrated, which is not? So for that, each pressure gauge will have a serial number written on that. So this is pressure gauge number 1, this is pressure gauge number 2, 3, 4, 5. And then for each of these pressure gauges, you will maintain the calibration record. So that way you will know that this particular gauge is calibrated and this particular gauge is not calibrated. That is identification and status. Another requirement related to the monitoring and measuring devices is protection and safeguarding. So these equipment which you have calibrated, they are good equipment. So you need to protect them, safeguard them. You need to make sure that by mistake, somebody doesn't change the setting on that. That will make it uncalibrated or that will make it read wrong. So you want to prevent that, and you want to prevent the damage of that or deterioration of these equipment. Because let's say if you have decided to calibrate this particular pressure gauge once in a year, then you need to maintain that in a good condition for 1 year. Now here is an interesting clause which is adverse effect and actions. Now let's assume that you send a pressure gauge for calibration, which you have been using for, let's say, 1 year or 2 years, and every year you send it for calibration. Let's say you now send it for calibration, and then the company who did this calibration, or let's say your own internal lab who did this calibration, they come out with the finding that this equipment is no more calibrated. For example, instead of 100 psi, this is actually reading 120 psi. Something has changed, something is broken, or maybe setting has changed. This equipment is wrong. So one thing which you can do is immediately reset that, and based on that resetting, you will make sure that now this equipment reads 100 psi. That part is good. What's the problem here? The problem here is that this equipment which was reading 120 instead of 100 psi, this was in use for last 1 year. So that means a lot of readings which you have taken using this equipment might be wrong. And that could have an adverse effect on your product which you are making. So whatever you have already shipped, that is based on this particular gauge which was wrong, and you found this during calibration. So in that sort of a situation, when you find out that previous measurements were affected, then you need to take some appropriate action for that. Now appropriate action could be recalling all the products which you have sent out because they were based on some wrong readings. So you need to recall them. Or maybe you can just live with that because let's say your out of calibration was very small and there was a safety margin already available. So based on that, you might decide that, okay, we can live with that. But I'm not saying you reject, recall, or live with that. But what standard says is you need to make a deliberate decision that what would you do in that case when the equipment which you send was out of calibration. Then you need to see that what all was measured previously and what is the impact of that and what action you need to take for that. So this was clause number 7.1.5, measuring and monitoring devices. And in 7.1, we have one more thing to cover under resources, and that is 7.1.6, organizational knowledge. Knowledge is also a resource. So standard requires that companies should identify what is the knowledge required for the job, what they are doing, and then they need to maintain that knowledge, keep it up to date and relevant, and make sure that this knowledge is available for use for the necessary people who are doing the job, who need this knowledge. This knowledge could be the technology which you are using, the processes which you are following, the codes and standards which you are implementing. That is knowledge part. So that needs to be maintained. And also remember that with the changing needs and the trends, you might need a different level or different type of knowledge to continue your operation. So that also need to be reviewed time to time, that is there any need to have some additional knowledge to do our job. And when we say knowledge, knowledge is both internal and external. So there are some internal sources of knowledge and then there are some external sources of knowledge. Let's quickly look at some of the examples of that. So here are some of the examples of internal sources. Internal sources of knowledge could be intellectual property of the company, how they do the job, their patents, their trademarks, their proprietary information. It could be experience which is gained from employees and the expertise of people who are doing this job. That is knowledge. Knowledge is also lessons learned from the past projects, looking at the successes and failures in the past. Some knowledge would have been accumulated based on that. That is internal knowledge. And then there is undocumented knowledge. And undocumented knowledge is also called as the tacit knowledge. So knowledge has two parts, the explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is something which you can put on a document. That is explicit. But then there is a tacit knowledge, which is the type of skills, the behavior, the way of doing things, which you really cannot capture on a document. That is undocumented knowledge, which basically comes from the experience of people, which you really cannot put on a piece of paper. And another example of internal resources in case of knowledge is improvements, which are coming as a part of continuous improvement processes of products and services. That is also internal knowledge. So these are some of the examples of internal knowledge. Coming to the external components or the external sources of knowledge, these are industry standards such as ASME standard or BSI standards. And the second part is academic research, which is coming from the research papers, studies, etc. That is external knowledge. Customer feedback is also external knowledge. So the companies might gain some insight from the customer's feedback and complaint. That is also a source of external knowledge. Supplier and partner knowledge is another source, and the market trend in general, how your competitors are doing and the benchmarking against best in class. So these are the types of external sources for organizational knowledge. So this was the sixth component in 7.1, which is resources. And we are talking about the organizational knowledge. So we have talked a lot in 7.1. We have talked about a lot of resources such as people, infrastructure, environment, monitoring and measuring devices, and organizational knowledge. So we have talked a lot in this section, which is 7.1. Now, what all are the key actions which companies need to do? First thing is they need to identify what are the types of resources they need, which we have talked here in 6 different components from 7.1.1 to 7.1.6. So those resources companies need to look at and see that what all they need to do their job. And then they need to verify that they have the right people with the right competency, they have the right building, equipment, facilities, ensure that the physical and the psychological conditions support the operation. When it comes to measuring and monitoring devices, these need to be calibrated and maintained on a scheduled basis, and you need to keep a record of them in the form of, let's say, calibration log, and then you need to determine and provide required knowledge for people to do the job. Basically, a lot of things to be considered in 7.1, which is resources. And we are at clause number 7, which is support. So in support, we have talked about resources in 7.1. In the next video, we will talk about 7.2, 3, and 4. In the clause number 7, which was support, previously we talked about 7.1, which was resources. And in that, we had a long discussion on different types of resources which companies need to provide for implementing ISO 9001 standard, or actually for doing the job. For doing the job, they need all that resources. Now coming to 7.2, which is competence. In 7.1 earlier, we did talk about people as a resource. But in 7.2, it emphasizes that people should have necessary competence to do the job. And here we are talking about necessary competence for people doing the job that affects the performance and effectiveness of the quality management system. So those people who are affecting the quality management system need to have a proper competence to do their job. Competence can be determined based on the education, training, or experience. And if there is a lack of competence, then the company or the organization need to take necessary action to provide the competence and evaluate the effectiveness of that action. Let's say if somebody is not able to do the job because that person is not competent, let's say the person doesn't have the necessary experience, person doesn't have necessary qualification, person doesn't have necessary training. So in that case, company need to provide necessary training, coaching, or experience to make sure that this person is able to do the job properly. And the company need to evaluate these actions, whether these actions actually led to the result which they were expecting. But in addition to that, companies need to retain documented information as evidence of competence. Now, this might not require for everyone, but for some critical jobs, it is definitely required to have a proper documentation of competence. For example, a person who is doing welding inspection. So in that case, you need to have some documentation to prove that this person is competent to do welding inspection. But for many other cases, the resume of the person, the experience of the person listed in the resume might be good enough. So depending on the situation, you need to maintain the records of the competence for people who are doing the job which is affecting the quality management system. Now coming to the key action for 7.2, basically in 7.2, the key action is you need to determine the gap. If there's a gap between the competence, what people have and what is expected, then the companies need to develop some training program, coaching, or need to take some action to address that gap. That's 7.2, which is competence. Now coming to the next clause, which is clause number 7.3, awareness. In awareness, the companies are required to ensure that the people who are doing job are aware of what? Aware of quality policy. We did talk about quality policy previously. We did talk about quality objectives. So people need to be aware of their respective objectives. People need to be aware of the quality policy in general. They need to be aware of the contribution they make to the quality management system, what contribution they make to the product or service which they are delivering. And they should also be aware of not conforming to the QMS requirement, that what happens if they don't follow rules, if they don't follow the requirements, then what is the implication of that. Now coming to the key actions, that's simple. People need to be aware of these things, and there should be a regular communication, and there should be some engaging activities which will lead people to understand what is their job, how their job makes the product or the service successful, what is the impact of not meeting these requirements, what is the quality policy, what are their specific quality objectives, etc. So make people aware of that. That is clause number 7.3. Now coming to 7.4, which is communication. So in communication, the requirement is simple, that organization need to determine internal and external communication related to the quality management system. They need to determine that what needs to be communicated, when to communicate, with whom to communicate, and how to communicate, and who communicates. So these things need to be sorted out in the organization. And this is a very general requirement, that you need to have some communication method, some communication protocol in place in the organization. And here are the key actions for 7.4 that you need to establish, or the companies need to establish clear communication channels and protocols. That is 7.4. So in the first video, in clause number 7, we talked about 7.1, which was resources. In this video, we talked about 7.2, 3, and 4. Now let's talk about one more component of clause 7, which is 7.5, documented information. Let's talk about that in the next video. Now coming to the last subclause of clause number 7, which is support. And clause number 7.5 is documented information. So we have already talked about 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, and 7.4. Now we are at 7.5, which is documented information. We did talk about documented information earlier in the fundamental concepts. There we talked about maintaining documented information means documents. Retaining documented information means the record. Now let's look at the requirements related to the documented information. The first one is 7.5.1 general. So here standard says that organization's quality management system will have two types of documented information. One is what is required by 9001, and we did talk about a list of mandatory documents and mandatory records earlier in the fundamental concepts. Let's say quality policy is a mandatory document, quality objective is a mandatory document, management review report is a mandatory record. So we did talk about those records and documents earlier which are required by ISO 9001 standard. That is one part. But in addition to that, there will be some documented information which is determined by the organization depending on the type of work which they do. So not every company will have just the documents which are prescribed by 9001. 9001 is a generic standard. They don't know whether you are making rockets or you are just making a pencil. So they don't know that. So depending on making rocket, you might need more records for statutory or regulatory requirements. You might need more data, more information to improve your processes as compared to the company which is making pencils. So that is the second part, that the documented information that is determined by the organization to do their job. So there are two types of documents. Now the extent of documentation might differ. 9001 is valid for a small company, a pencil manufacturing company. 9001 is also applicable for a rocket making company. But these are two different type of companies. So the level and extent of documentation for these companies might be different. So this was general requirement. Now coming to 7.5.2, which is on creating and updating. So in the quality management system, you might have to make some processes, procedures, work instructions, checklists, data sheets, all those things which you will have to make. That's what is covered in creating and updating. So when you are creating or updating a documented information or a document, then make sure that this is clearly identified. So you make a procedure, then it should clearly specify what is the title of this procedure, what is the purpose of this, what is the date, who is the author, maybe a revision number of that, maybe some reference number to that. All that is required to clearly identify what process or procedure which you are making. Then you need to have a proper or appropriate format for that. Some companies use paper format, All their processes, procedures, work instructions are in paper format, in the written text format. Some other company might have these in the form of flow charts, flow diagrams, and some other company might have all these in electronic media. So the appropriate format might differ for different companies, and all types of formats are acceptable by ISO 9001. ISO 9001 doesn't say that you need to have a paper copy. You can have electronic copy if that works for you. Another important aspect is when you are issuing a document, then it needs to be reviewed and approved to make sure that this is suitable and this is adequate. That is a quite natural requirement. When you issue a document, somebody will review that, somebody will approve that, and you would have seen the signatures on that document which says that prepared by this, checked by this, reviewed by this, approved by this. So you might have different boxes for the approval process, and that's what ISO 9000 is asking for. So this was about creating and updating documented information. 7.5.3, which is the next sub clause, is control of documented information. You have made a procedure. Let's say you have made a procedure on how to fasten bolts or how to do the welding. Whatever process you are doing, you made a procedure on that. That needs to be controlled. When I say control, or when the standard says control, it means the right documented information is available at the place where it is being used and when it is being used. So let's say a procedure related to welding should be easily accessible to the person who is doing the welding, and that person should have the right revision of the document. Let's say you made revision number 1 of the document and gave it to the person who is doing the job. Then there was some change, and then you made a revision number 2 of that document, but you did not issue that revision to the person who is actually doing the job, and the revised copy is just in your computer or in a file. Then it doesn't make sense, because the person doing the job will still be doing on the basis of the older version, and that might not be the right thing to do. That's what standard says, that ensure that the documented information is available and suitable for use when and where needed. And in addition to making sure that the right document is available at the right place, you need to protect these documents. Protect it from the point of confidentiality. Protect it, let's say, from fire. If you have a number of records which you have kept in a room, then you need to make sure that that room is protected from fire, flood, or other losses by which you might lose the data which you have collected. This might be again a paper copy, or this might be a soft copy, electronic copy. You need to protect that data. You need to protect the integrity of the data. And some other requirements related to control of documents are distribution, access, retrieval, and use, so that the copy of the document is distributed to the right people. The right people have access to that. They can retrieve that documented information when they need that and use that. It needs to be stored and preserved, and you need to have control of change. That is an important thing, which is the version control. And I did talk about that it will be wrong that revision 2 of the document is issued, but the person doing job is still working on revision number 1. That is basically the control of change. And then document needs to be retained, and disposition of these documents need to be done. What does that mean? Some laws in some countries require that you need to retain that copy for so many years. This type of documents need to be retained for 5 years. Some contractual documents might need to be retained for 20 years. So you need to make sure that you have that retention program in place. And when I say retention, that also needs to be protected from fire, flood, and other type of losses. And next part of this is disposition. That basically means that when you don't need that document, you need to dispose it off. You don't want to keep unnecessary documents. Companies do not want to keep more document, because sometimes these extra documents could go against them. For example, let's say in my country, which is Canada, you are required to keep your tax information for 7 years. So for 7 years, you need to protect that information. All your tax returns, all the information related to tax returns need to be retained for 7 years. But then what about the information prior to that? That needs to be destroyed, because who knows, sometime that information might be used against you, even though you are not required to retain that information. That is the disposition part. Once you are not required, just dispose that off. Companies have different policies. Don't go by my words. Look at the company policy, what your company policy talks about, at what level, for how many years you need to retain, and what is needed to be done to dispose these off. So go by the company policy. Continuing on the same discussion, the documented information of external origin is also to be identified and controlled. Now, what is the documented information of external origin? This might be the information from your suppliers which you are getting, or any other external information that also need to be appropriately controlled. And the last part of this is the documented information retained as evidence of conformity. So basically, we are talking about the record of things being checked. So there will be a record sheet which will say that, okay, this piece was supposed to be 100 millimeter. We checked it and we found it 101, and so on. So you have a record of that. That record need to be maintained, and this should be protected from unintended alteration. So people should not be unintentionally change that reading or change that value. So it needs to be protected against that as well. So this was clause number 7.5. Let's quickly wrap it up. And in a very simple and plain terms, when we are talking about documented information, the simple requirement is that you need to have a robust document control system to manage the documented information. So with this, we complete clause number 7, which is support. Now the next clause, which is clause number 8, is operation. And that is a very big clause. We will be covering this in multiple videos. So let's talk about that starting from the next video. Now coming to the next clause of ISO 9001 2015 version standard, and that is clause number 8, operation. Previously, when I was talking about, let's say, clause number 5, 6 or 7, I could comfortably say that we will cover this clause in 2 videos or 3 videos because those were shorter clauses. But when it comes to clause number 8, which is operations, there are lots and lots of requirements in this particular clause. So at this stage, I cannot say whether I will be completing this clause in 10 videos or 15 videos. But let's go slowly and learn about this. Now, this clause is about the operational aspect of the organization. Whatever processes, products or services this company is delivering, this clause is focused on those aspects of planning, implementing and controlling the quality requirements related to that product, service or process. Now, when it comes to clause 8, there are 7 sub clauses of that, 8.1 to 8.7. Let's start with clause number 8.1. Now, clause 8.1 is operational planning and control. And if you remember earlier when we looked at clause number 6, that was planning. That planning in clause number 6 was related to the planning for the quality management system. This planning, which is the clause number 8.1, is related to the operational planning and control. Planning related to the type of work this company is doing. That's what is covered in this. So what this clause required is that the organizations shall plan, implement and control the processes needed to meet the requirements of whatever product or service they are making. So whatever job they are doing, they need to plan for that, they need to implement that plan, and that needs to be controlled. That's what this clause is referring to. Now in this, you also need to think about the risks and opportunities which you earlier identified in clause number 6.1. Think about those as well. Now coming to the requirements which are listed in this clause, which is 8.1, it requires the organization to determine the processes, that what processes they will be following and what will be the acceptance criteria. This is what we will do, and this is what will decide whether our job is good or bad. And for doing the job and in the planning phase, you also plan for the resources, what you need to make sure that you meet the requirements of the product and service. And when you are implementing a process, you also might need some controls to check whether those requirements are being met or not. So you need to define those controls. In addition to that, you need to maintain and retain documented information. So what does that mean? You need to maintain means you need to have documents which tell that what you need to do, what are the acceptance criteria, what are the controls, what are the resources. So you need to maintain documents related to that, and also you need to retain documents or retain records which say that you have met those requirements. Now this particular clause is a high level clause. It covers the overall planning aspect, so it doesn't specifically say about a specific activity, but it generally says that whatever job you are doing, whatever controls you are putting on that, whatever planning you have done, you need to maintain and retain documents related to that so that you can show that you have met the requirements what you have defined, or what customer is asked for, or what regulatory requirements have asked for. So you will have the proof of that you have met those requirements. So this is clause number 8.1. Now, just to wrap it up, now let's look at the key actions. And the key actions are basically the summary of this clause, what you need to do to implement clause number 8.1. First thing is, when you're implementing clause 8.1, which is operational planning, you need to take care of risks and opportunities which you have identified earlier. Then you need to define the process steps, that these are the steps, these are the controls which you are putting for those processes. You need to allocate resources, you need to monitor the process, check them whether the requirements are being met or not, and then you need to keep record of everything, record of the requirement and record of the action being taken and the outcome of the process. This is clause number 8.1, which is organizational planning and control. Now, in the next video, we will talk about 8.2, which is requirements for products and services. Under clause number 8, which is operation, previously we talked about clause number 8.1, which was organizational planning and control. That was 8.1. Now coming to clause number 8.2, which is requirements for products and services. Now 8.1 was related to planning. Now the next step is to understand what does customer want. So here in this clause, we are expected to know that what product or service we are going to produce, whether those meet the requirements of the customer or not. That's what we will be covering in clause number 8.2. So here the focus is on the customer requirements and the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. And for that, we need to have a good, effective communication with the client, and we need to review the requirements of the client. That's clause number 8.2. Now 8.2 also has been divided into 4 parts, 8.2.1 to 8.2.4. Let's cover these clauses in 2 videos. In this one, we will cover the first 2 sub clauses, 8.2.1 and 8.2.2, and in the next video, we will cover the balance part of this. Coming to the first part out of the 4 pieces of 8.2. First part is customer communication. So here the standard requires that we or the organization need to have communication with the customer. This communication is to make sure that we clearly understand the requirements of the customer. When it comes to the communication with the customer, there are various aspects which are listed in the standard. One thing is, we need to understand about the product or service the customer wants. So the communication has to be related to that, related to the information for the product or service which customer is expecting from us, handling customer inquiries, contracts and orders. That also is part of communication with customer feedback and customer complaints. The standard does not clearly talk much about customer complaints, but as a general practice, it will be a good idea that all the customer complaints should be separately listed down, because those are good source of information for improvement. This is one of the important aspects of management review, which we will be talking later on. Another aspect of communication is handling and controlling customer property. So sometimes customer will give some property. This property could be some information or some physical parts which this organization has to take care of. So when the customer provides some property or some information, then how this is handled and controlled, that is also part of customer communication. And if required, a contingency plan is also expected to be prepared. Now, when I say contingency plan is to take care of unexpected events. For example, let's say what will happen when a critical part of the process fails in the organization, or the machine breakdown, or there's a flood, or there's a fire. So those sort of a contingency plan also might be needed as a part of customer communication. That what will happen if this sort of a scenario happens. So depending on the situation, you might have to have a contingency action plan as well. So this is about the communication aspect, which is clause number 8.2.1. So after 8.2.1, which is customer communication, 8.2.2 is determining requirements for products and services. As a part of this requirement, the organization is expected to ensure that the customer requirements and the applicable legal requirements are determined, and the organization can meet the claims for their product or service it offers. As a part of determining requirements for product and service, you need to look at the statutory and regulatory requirements related to the product and service, and also additional requirements which are determined by the organization itself. So remember that in addition to the requirements provided by the customer and provided by the legal aspects, which are the statutory and regulatory requirements, the company also might have certain requirements for the product or service, because this company is specialist in that particular product and service. So they know much better about the product and service requirements. So company also might have additional requirements more than what customer is asking and what legal requirements are. So this is 8.2.2, which is determining requirements for the product and service. Now, as the next step, which we will be covering, we will need to see whether we can meet those requirements or not. Let's talk about that in the next video. In the previous two sub-clauses of 8.2, we talked about customer communication and understanding the requirements. Now coming to the next part of this, here we want to review the requirements of product and service, so that is 8.2.3. So now here in this particular sub-clause, the organization is expected to review the customer requirements before committing the product or service to the customer. And here they do it to make sure that the company can meet those requirements. In the previous versions of ISO 9001, this particular aspect was also called as the contract review, and that's what we are doing here. We are reviewing the contract to make sure that we can meet these requirements which customer is asking from us as an organization. Now, when you are reviewing the contract or reviewing the customer requirements, here are some of the aspects which you need to review. One is customer specific requirements, what customer is asking, which also include delivery, not only the product, but also the delivery and the post delivery activities. Post delivery, such as the warranty, such as the maintenance, such as providing the spare parts, etc. Those need to be reviewed. Another one is requirements not stated by the customer but are necessary for its use. When you go buy a car, you don't put all the requirements specifically that my car should have these safety aspects, this should have a reliable braking system. You don't ask for those requirements specifically, but as a producer of car or the car manufacturer, they know that these are the things which are necessary for the product to work properly. So all the requirements which are not specifically asked by customer but are necessary, those also need to be reviewed. In addition to that, you need to review statutory and regulatory requirements of product and service, and any other requirement which is determined by the organization. This could be based on the historical performance of the company, some lessons learned, whatever aspect it is, because this company has designed and produced this product, so this company might have additional requirements as well. That also would need to be reviewed, and any difference between the initial discussion and the changes, those need to be resolved. Let's say you and me are going into a contract. So first we agree on a contract that this is what we want. Or let's say if you are going to buy a car, you agree with the dealer that this is what you want, this color car, this model, these features. But then later on, if there are changes related to those aspects, then those changes also need to be incorporated in the contract and needed to be reviewed. So these are the aspects related to the contract which needed to be reviewed as a part of 8.2.3. Sometimes you might not have a formal contract. So for example, if you go to a coffee shop and this coffee shop is implementing ISO 9001 processes, and now you ask for the coffee, the person giving you coffee will ask you to give a contract document asking for that what you want as a part of coffee. You didn't expect that. What you expected in this situation was you will tell the person that this is the coffee I need, and that person has to give you that coffee. But how does that person do the contract review? And that is covered as a part of this particular aspect, where it says that when the customer does not provide a documented statement of the requirements, in this case of coffee, we have not provided a documented statement of our requirement. In that case, organization shall confirm them before acceptance. Now, how does that get confirmed? So the person who is making coffee will ask or tell me back that, okay, you asked for this coffee, whether you are asked for medium strength coffee, and whether you want milk, how much sugar. So that person who is making coffee will tell me back, and that will be the confirmation that the contract has been understood clearly. And then in addition to that, there is a requirement related to retaining documented information on the review of the contract and any changes to the contract. So retain documentation, and obviously contract documents are generally an important document which need to be retained just in case the customer says that the requirements have not been met. So you need to have a documented information for the contract review. Coming to the last part of 8.2, which is changes to requirements for product and service. So let's say you had a good communication with your customer, that is established, you understood the requirements and you made sure that you can meet those requirements. Now what happens if there are changes to the requirements for the product or service? In that case, the organization need to make sure that those changes are properly communicated to the right people in the organization and they are properly documented. So whatever documented information you had earlier, you might have to update that. And before you implement those changes need to be reviewed and controlled to make sure that the product and service is still meeting the requirements. When it comes to managing changes, there are two aspects listed in ISO 9001 standard. One is to review and control the changes so that the conformity is still maintained. You cannot make changes just like that, because making change at one place could affect many other places. And these changes need to be communicated to all relevant interested parties, which could include people who are doing job and the customer. So this was clause number 8.2, which is requirements for products and service. So once again, to recap, in 8.1 we talked about planning, the operational planning. In 8.2 we talked about understanding the requirements related to the customer. Now let's just wrap up 8.2 and look at the key aspects or key actions for 8.2. So here we have the summary of 8.2. The first one, which is 8.21, is establish clear communication channel so that you can understand the customer requirements. The next part was identifying and documenting requirements. And the third part was conducting a thorough review of those requirements to make sure that the organization can meet those requirements. And the last part was managing changes, because changes need to be controlled and changes need to be monitored and communicated to the right people. So this was clause number 8.2, which is related to the requirements, understanding the customer requirements. Now the next one, 8.3, will be on design and development. Let's talk about that starting from the next video. So in the main clause 8, which is operation, the first one was 8.1 for planning, 8.2 was related to understanding the requirements. Now clause number 8.3 is on design and development of products and services. So the purpose of this clause is to make sure that whatever product or service the organization is making, that meets the customer requirements, meets the legal requirements, and also meets the company's own requirements. And this clause provides a structured way of designing and development of products and services. Before I proceed further, let's understand that when we talk of design and development, don't just think of designing a car, designing a rocket, designing a pencil. Don't think of just a product as a part of this. Think of services as well. In services also you need designing. Let's say if you are a travel agency and travel agency also designs a holiday package. That holiday package is also a product or service this company is offering. That also requires design and development. So think broader when you are looking at design and development of products and service. Just don't think of designing a product, designing a car, making the drawing, putting the dimensions. Don't just think in that term. Now, when it comes to 8.3, which is design and development, there are 6 sub clauses in this, 8.3.1 to 8.3.6. Now, what we have in these 6 sub clauses, the first sub clause is a general sub clause, which we will be talking immediately after this. The next one is planning for designing and development. Then we will talk about the inputs, then the controls, then the outputs, and then the change management. So these are the aspects related to design and development, which we will be talking as a part of 8.3. Let's talk about 8.3.1, which is a general statement or a general requirement. It says that the company or the organization shall establish, implement, and maintain a design and development process. That's it. It's a simple statement, introductory statement to this clause. Nothing very specific about that. It simply says that the company shall establish a process and maintain that process and implement that process. Coming to the next sub part of this, which is 8.3.2, which is planning part. Now, when you are planning for design and development, remember that we have already talked about 2 aspects of planning earlier. In clause number 6, we talked about planning for quality management system. Then we also talked about planning as a part of 8.1. So in operations also, we talked about operational planning. Now here we are talking about design and development planning. When it comes to design and development planning, there are various aspects which are needed to be considered. And these aspects are listed on this slide. So when you are doing design and development activity, you need to look at the nature, duration, and the complexity of the job, of the product and service. Based on that, you can change the design and development process. The design and development process for a pencil designing is not the same as design and development for the rocket which NASA is sending to Mars. So these are 2 different things. So you need to make your process suitable for the design and development activity which you are doing. You need to clearly define the stages of design and development activities. There is a need to have verification and validation. So we will be talking about verification and validation when we will talk about design control as a part of clause number 8.3. So that also needed to be established, that these are the verification and validation activities which we are considering. Then you also need to consider the responsibilities and authorities, who is doing what. You also need to consider the involvement of customer, users and other stakeholders as necessary in design and development activities. So for example, if you are a home builder and you need to involve right people in the design, so right people would be, let's say, the customer might tell you what type of layout they are expecting. You also might need to consider the regulatory requirements or the legal requirements laid out by city, laid out by province, laid out by the country. So as necessary, you need to engage right people in the design and development activity. In the design and development activity, you might have multiple parties participating in that. So you need to control the interfaces between them. Let's say when you're designing a car, you need to have interface with manufacturing, that when you're designing how manufacturing will be producing that. So manufacturing might have their own say when the design is being made. So those interfaces need to be controlled between different groups who are involved in the design and development activity. And then as a part of planning, you need to plan for the documented information which will show that the design and development requirements are met. So these are some of the considerations which have been listed in the standard, which are needed to be considered when you are planning for design and development activities. Now coming to the next sub part of this, which is design and development inputs. So as a part of design and development inputs, the organization is expected to identify the requirements related to the product or service which is being designed. So that will be the input for the design, all the requirements which are needed to be incorporated in the design. Now, what are the sources of these inputs? You can get these inputs from the requirements for the product, which are the functional and performance requirements. That will be input. So for example, when you are designing a car, then you will have some functional and performance requirements. My car should give this much mileage. My car should have this much pickup. So those are the requirements, or those are the inputs which are needed for the design and development activities. You might also need information from the previous similar design and development activities. So the information from the previous design would be helpful in making this design. You also need to consider the statutory and regulatory requirements. So those are also inputs for the design. And inputs for design also includes the codes and standards which the company is committed to implement. And then you also need to consider the potential consequences of a failure. That also is the input for design. So these are some of the inputs which you would need to consider when you are designing a product or service. Now, these are some of the specific requirements which are listed in the standard, that when you are listing down the inputs, those inputs should be adequate for the design and development. They should be complete and unambiguous, what you expect this design to do. And then the conflicting requirements must be resolved. Let's say customer says one thing and then there's a different legal requirement. So you need to consolidate that. Those conflicting requirements need to be resolved before you proceed with the design. The last requirement here is the companies need to retain documented information on the design and development inputs, so that tomorrow also if there's a problem, you can see that these were the inputs which were defined for this particular product or service. So those need to be documented. So this is one part of this clause, which is 8.3 design and development. Let's cover the balance part in the next video. In the design and development activities, which is clause number 8.3, previously we talked about general, we talked about planning, and we talked about inputs for the design and development activities. Now coming to the next part, that once you have the input, then you do the actual design. And during that actual design and development, you need some controls to check that the requirements are being met, the results are being achieved. So there are three types of controls when it comes to the design and development activities: the review, the verification, and the validation. And we need to keep the documented information related to the design controls. Now, we said that there are three types of design controls: review, verification, and validation. Let's understand them on the next slide. Now, when we say review, now here we are looking at the results of design and development activities to make sure that they meet the requirements. For example, when it comes to design review, typically it is done as a part of group, where as a part of group, you review whether the requirements which were specified are being met by this design or not. That is review. So here you look at the design documentation, here you look at the design processes and plan and see whether that is meeting the objective or not. So that was a design review. Now coming to the next one, which is design verification. Think of verification as the inspection. So in verification, you do the activities to ensure that the design and development output meets the input requirement. So you have certain inputs that your design should do this, this, and this, and then you verify that whether your design actually produces that output or not, whether the input requirements are being met or not. Let's say the input says, as a part of code and standard, that the thickness of this vessel should be this much. And this is how these need to be calculated. So in verification, you actually check whether the thickness of that vessel actually meets the code requirement or not. Now, code requirement was an input, and here by doing this verification, we are checking whether the input requirements are being met or not. That is verification. So we talk about review, we talk about verification. Now the next one is validation. Validation is to ensure that the resulting product or service, and I'm not talking about the design, here I'm talking about the product or service, meets the requirements for the specified application or intended use. So in validation, we actually see whether the actual product is meeting the requirements or not. That is validation. So in case of car design, validation will be actually running the car and seeing the mileage, seeing the pickup of that. In case of designing a biscuit, the actual validation will be giving that biscuit to a number of people, asking them to taste that and checking whether the requirements which we established are met or not. That is validation. So validation is actually using the product. So these are the three types of controls for design and development activities, which is under clause number 8.3.4. So now we talk about planning, we talk about inputs, and we also talk about controls. Now the next step in design and development activity will be the output of the design. That is clause number 8.3.5. Now here the output should meet the input requirements. That's one requirement. That's very obvious. And output should be adequate for subsequent product and service processes. So whatever design and development output you have produced, that should be good enough to go to the next step. Now in case of, let's say, car design, the next step will be the manufacturing of that, buying out components. So the design and the development output should be good enough or adequate to go for the production, to go for buying those components which are bought from outside. And output should include or reference the monitoring and measuring requirements and acceptance criteria. So what will be measured, what will be the acceptance criteria, what will be the tolerance, what will be the surface finish, all those things should be part of design and development output. And it also should list down all the important features of the product or service for the intended or the safe use, that this is what you need to do to make sure that the product is being used safely. And you need to retain documented information on the output, design and development output. That's 8.3.5. Now coming to the last part of this, which is 8.3.6, design and development changes. So we talk about planning, we talk about inputs, controls, and outputs. Now there is a possibility that you might have to make some changes to the design and development. When it comes to changes related to design and development, you or the organization need to identify, review, and control changes. Once again, making change to one component in the car would affect many other components. So any change should be made in a clear, systematic way. And when you make change, make sure that these do not affect the requirements which the product is expected to meet. And you need to retain documented information for the changes and the result of review of the changes. That these are the changes which we are making. This is the result of the review, because before you make change, somebody needs to review that. Somebody needs to check the impact of that. For example, let's say when you are making or designing a car, somebody might come with an idea that, okay, let's put a thicker, let's say, tire on that, or a bigger tire on that. But it's not just a tire which is getting affected. Lot many other things in the design also will get affected by that single change. So somebody needs to review, somebody needs to check what will be the impact of this change, and then whosoever is authorizing that change, that also need to be identified and documented. That the review was done, this person or this group did that review, and what are the actions taken to avoid unintended results. So by making this change, something might go wrong, and these are the actions which we have taken. That is design change. So in summary, changes need to be controlled and should be done systematically, and you need to retain the documented information related to changes. So now let's wrap up clause number 8.3, which is design and development. So in this, there were 6 clauses starting with the general. So let's keep away general. But then after general, we had a clause related to planning. Here we were expected to do a proper planning for design and development. And the next step was getting inputs. So here we were looking at the inputs which are needed for the design. This could be the customer requirements. These could be statutory or regulatory requirements, or these could be standards and codes. And as a part of reviewing inputs, you need to make sure that if there are any conflicting requirements, those need to be resolved. Once you have the right input, then the next step was to actually do the design and development activity. And for that, you need some controls. And for that, we talked about 3 types of controls: review, verification, and validation. And we also talked about the difference between them. The next step was looking at the output. So we need to look at whether the output is complete, it meets all the requirements, and it is good for the next step, such as the production. And it has all the requirements, all the acceptance criteria, all the measurements which are needed to be taken, that are all listed as a part of design and development output. And the last thing which we talked about was design and development changes. So you need to carefully plan and monitor changes so that they do not result in some unintended results. So changes need to be maintained, monitored, and controlled. So this was clause number 8.3, which is on design and development. So once again, let's recap. We are in clause number 8, which is operation. And in operation, we talked about 8.1 was on planning, operational planning. 8.2 was on understanding the requirements. 8.3 was on actually doing the design and development. And once you have done the design and development, the next clause will be related to the externally provided services. So we need to look at those as well, and then we will go into the actual production. But right now, in the next video, we will talk about 8.4, which is control of externally provided processes, products, and services. Under clause number 8, which is operation, Previously, we talked about 8.3, which was on design and development. Now coming to 8.4. 8.4 is control of externally provided processes, products and services. So here we are focusing on anything which is coming from outside your organization, and that becomes the input for your product or process or your service. Now these external providers could be your suppliers, could be your contractors, could be your partners. But for the sake of simplicity, in this video, I'll be calling all external providers as suppliers. So whether they are supplier, they are contractor, or they are your partners, let's call them suppliers for the sake of simplicity. I'm sure you understand that as a company, if something goes wrong, you cannot say to your customers that no, that's not our problem. This is something which was provided by our supplier or our partners. You own the responsibility if you are supplying a product or service to your customers. So that means you need to have a control on all the inputs which are provided by your suppliers or your external providers. And that's what this particular clause focuses on. How do you control? How do you manage your external providers? Now this clause has three sub clauses, 8.4.1 to 8.4.3. Let's talk about 8.4.1, which is a general clause. Now in this, it says that the organization must ensure that the external providers conform to requirements. So in simple words, all the external suppliers which are providing something to your organization, which becomes input for you to work on, they should conform to specified requirements. So now there are three scenarios here. One is when something is provided by your suppliers and that becomes part of your product or service. For example, let's say a car manufacturing company buys the windscreen, buys the tires, buys some steel material. Those are inputs they are buying from external providers. So that is one thing where that externally provided product or service becomes the part of your own product or service. Another case could be when the product or service by your supplier is directly provided to the customer on your behalf. So this you can consider as drop shipping, where you receive an order and then you give it to your subcontractor and ask the subcontractor to directly supply an item or a product or service to your customer. So these were two scenarios related to product, whether that product becomes a part of your product or that product is supplied directly to the customer. Third scenario could be related to a process or a part of process which is performed by your suppliers. So this clause applies to all of these three types of scenarios. Now, this particular clause, which is a general clause, requires that the company shall establish and apply the evaluation, selection, monitoring, performance, and re-evaluation of external providers. So in simple terms, so let's say you are getting some material from your supplier, but before you get that material, you need to do some evaluation. You need to select those suppliers, and then you need to monitor their performance, and then you need to re-evaluate these time to time so that to make sure that these external providers or these suppliers meet your requirement. That's the requirement here in 8.4.1. And when you are doing all this, evaluating, re-evaluating, selecting, the criteria should be based on the ability to provide that particular product or service what your company is asking for. Whether that particular supplier can provide that service or not, that should form the basis of the criteria which you are establishing for, let's say, selecting the supplier or monitoring the supplier. And the company need to retain the documented information related to evaluation of this supplier, selection, monitoring and re-evaluation. Whatever you have done to make sure that this supplier is able to meet the requirement, that documentation should be retained. And if there is any action coming out of that, let's say if you are monitoring the performance of a supplier, the defect rate is going up, and then you have suggested some actions to be taken by supplier. So the result of that also should be documented. Now coming to the second part of this clause, which is 8.4.2, which is a type and extent of control. So now when you want to decide on what type of control we should be putting on a particular supplier, you cannot have the same level of control on all suppliers. For some suppliers, you will just buy the material and use them. For some suppliers, you will buy the material, but then you will do incoming inspection. And for some suppliers, you might have your person sitting in that facility doing inspection, looking at the processes. So depending on the situation, depending on the criticality, depending on the ability of supplier to meet the requirement, you will have different types of controls which you will put on suppliers. And also, once you have put those controls, checks and balances on your supplier, you will evaluate how much effective those controls are. And if these are not effective, you might want to change those controls. You might want to put extra checks and balances, extra inspections, or you might want to reduce those inspections. So depending on the situation, you will decide on what type of and what extent of controls you will be putting on your suppliers. And also these external processes, whatever external processes and products are being supplied by your supplier, that should be part of your quality management system as well. You own that process. You own those suppliers. You own the bad quality or the good quality of your suppliers. You are responsible for that. So with this, now let's look at what are the types of controls we can have on our supplier. So now here are some of the examples which I have listed here on this slide. The control methods could be supplier pre-qualification, supplier evaluation and selection, contractual agreements which you have with your supplier, and then inspection and testing. What you do, inspection or testing could be the testing or inspection before release or inspection during manufacturing in the supplier facility, or the incoming inspection when the material is received in your facility. You might consider supplier audits to make sure that the processes which are required are being implemented. Might have a performance monitoring, such as what is the defect rate, and then you could have some verification activities. Basically that is the same as inspection and testing, but verification would be more on a sort of a design part of the supplier. You can ask the supplier to provide quality control plan, inspection and test plan. You might do some document review also, not just physical inspection. You might ask your supplier to provide some document which tell that how they are doing their processes, and you might want to review them, comment on them. And then you can have supplier scorecard, incoming goods inspection, periodic supplier reviews, risk assessment, and corrective action requests if you find a non-conformity in the supplier processes. So there are various types of controls and the extent of controls which you can put on supplier to manage their quality. That's 8.4.2. Now coming to the last part of 8.4, which is information for external providers. Now, when you want to buy a material, let's say from your supplier, you need to make sure that you give right information and sufficient information to your supplier. Because if you don't tell your supplier what do you want and the information you have given to your supplier is not adequate, so there is a good chance that supplier will not meet those requirements because you have not clearly specified what do you want. That is one requirement, which is adequacy of requirements and communicating them to the external providers. So this is what this particular clause is requiring, that you need to have adequate information which is needed to be transferred to the supplier, and that needs to be clearly supplied to the supplier that this is exactly what you want. That way supplier can meet the requirements which you have put. So now when it comes to providing adequate information to the supplier, now what type of information we are looking at? The standard has given 6 of these items. 3 of them are listed here and 3 on the next slide. So when you are providing information to the supplier, communicating information to the supplier on what do you want, you need to tell the process, product and service, that what process, what product, what service you are expecting from this particular supplier. And then you need to specify the approval requirements, that who will approve the product and service, what supplier is providing, whether that will be approved by this company or whether the supplier is free to provide anything what they want. Supplier might be using different methods, processes, equipments. So if this company or the organization has any particular requirement related to the methods, related to the process, related to the equipment, that needs to be provided to the supplier. And also the approval for the release of products and service. How would the supplier release the product? There is a chance that we might ask our supplier that once you are satisfied, just ship that product to us. Another way could be that once you are ready, then tell us, that we will send one of our inspectors to check that item before you ship that. So that is approval for the release of product or service. That also needs to be specified. And then you also might want to specify the competence of people, that for doing this type of job, these are the qualifications, these are the competence we are looking from your people. So let's say for a particular type of tests, there are certain competencies which this inspector has to have. So if that is the case, then you need to clearly specify that, let's say, all your welding inspections should be done by a welding inspector who has this particular qualification. That needs to be provided to the supplier as a part of competence. So here are another 3 requirements which are expected to be provided to your suppliers. One is interactions, that what type of interactions will be there between supplier and the organization. Maybe there's a requirement to have a weekly meeting, monthly review meeting, whatever it is, that needs to be specified. So the next one is performance control and monitoring. So what type of controls and what type of monitoring will be performed by this organization on the external provider's performance? That needs to be specified. And the last part here is verification and validation. And we have talked about the difference between verification and validation when we talked about design and development activities. So all these requirements are needed to be provided to the supplier for providing the right product or service to the company. Now let's recap or wrap up this, which is clause number 8.4, control of externally provided processes, products and services. So what do we expect in this? What are the actions to be taken? One is evaluate and select suppliers. We did talk about that. Then you need to define and communicate requirements very clearly, what you expect from this particular supplier. And then you need to implement controls, checks, tests, inspections, and then you need to monitor the performance of this supplier. Another one is you might want to consider regular audits and reviews of this supplier. And for all these things, you need to maintain documented information. So this is clause number 8.4 on control of externally provided processes, products and services. Now 8.5 will be actual production. So far what we have done in clause number 8 operation is we have talked about planning, which was 8.1. And we have talked about requirements in 8.2, and in 8.3 we talked about design and development activities, and in 8.4 we talked about externally provided services, products and processes. Now in 8.5 we will actually produce the product or service what this company or this organization is expected to do. Let's talk about 8.5 in the next video. Previously in clause number 8.4, we talked about externally provided processes, products and services. So there we talked about how do we manage our suppliers, how do we manage our partners, because that affects our product or service. That was 8.4. Now coming to 8.5, which is production and service provision. This means providing the product and service, basically doing the thing what this company is expected to do. Make the product, make the car, make the pencil, provide the hospital services or book the tickets. So whatever product or service this company is providing, doing that is covered in this clause, which is 8.5. Now in 8.5, there are 6 sub-clauses, 8.5.1 to 8.5.6. And this we will be covering in multiple videos. For this video, let's focus on 8.5.1, which is the first part of 8.5, production and service provision. Now 8.5.1 is control of them, that whatever product or service you are making, that should be done under controlled condition. Now what are these control conditions? We need to put some controls, we need to put some checks and balances so that whatever job we do, that job is done good. And that's what is covered in 8.5.1. So in this, we need to look at what are the controls which are needed to make sure that the product or service which this organization is producing meets the requirements. So now when we talk of controlled conditions, so these are the controlled conditions which are defined by the standard. The first one is the availability of documented information. Related to what? Related to what product or service which we are producing and what results we want to achieve. Now the second item is availability of suitable monitoring and measuring resources. So that means whatever job we are doing, there will be some monitoring, some measurement. If you are making a car, then pieces are needed to be measured, pressure needs to be checked, viscosity of the fluid is required to be checked, and so on. So whatever measurements you are taking or doing, you need to have suitable resources for that. So that is another requirements for the control condition, which is the availability of monitoring and measuring resources, because that is the one which will tell whether you are meeting the requirements or not. And the third item in this list is monitoring and measuring activities. So previously we talked about availability of resources for that. Now the next part is actually doing the measuring and monitoring activities so that we can see that the output is meeting the input requirement and this is acceptable. Coming to few more on the next slide, which are here. Another thing as a part of control is infrastructure and environment. So you need some infrastructure for doing the job. You need the right environment. And then the competence of people. You need right people for doing the job. And the next item here is validation and revalidation. Previously also we talked about verification and validation. Now this validation is different. Here we are talking about validation of processes and validation of those processes where the result of output cannot be verified by subsequent monitoring and measurement. This particular requirement in the earlier versions of ISO 9001 was called as the special process. So the special processes are those processes where the output cannot be verified by checking. You need to do something to manage the process. So the process has to be right, and with that you would expect that the output would be right. For example, there are various processes such as welding, painting, etc. So the output cannot be really verified. Once you have done the welding, you cannot fully check whether this welding is done right or not. So for that, what you need to do is you need to pre-qualify the process. That is validation. So once your process is validated, you follow those parameters and follow that process requirements, because the output of welding cannot be checked by subsequent operations. So this is another requirement related to controls. And now here we have a few more. And in lean, there's a term POKA-YOKA, which is error proofing. So you might have to use some of those devices as a part of your process, that whatever error happens, that gets corrected or that gets caught immediately. And then the last one in this list is implementation of release, delivery, and post-delivery activities. So all these things are part of controls which are related to the product or service which you are producing, which are covered under 8.5.1. And once again, 8.5 is product and service provision. And here we are looking at 8.5.1, which is control of product and service provision. Now in the next video, we will talk about identification and traceability, which is another requirement in the product and service provision. In the previous video, we talked about 8.5.1, which was related to doing the production or providing the service under controlled conditions, and we looked at various controlled conditions. Now coming to the next subclause, which is 8.5.2, identification and traceability. So once again, this particular clause is part of 8.5, which is product and service provision, and which is part of clause number 8, which is operation. So under operation, we are looking at actually doing the job, and in that we are looking at the identification and traceability. Now for doing the job, identification and traceability is required to be maintained. So what this standard says is the output shall be identified suitably. So as a part of this, the company is required to make sure that the output has clear identification. So whatever product you are making, that should be clearly identifiable, and the status of that should be maintained throughout the production. So the identification could be done by putting a label or putting a traveler sheet on each piece which you are making. So depending on the criticality, depending on the product, you might have a different way to identify product or service which you are providing. That is the identification part. The second part of this is traceability. Now in traceability, the organization is required to control the unique identification of outputs when the traceability is a requirement. Now in identification, we were generally looking at the product, but in traceability, we need a unique identification of each output, and you are required to retain the documented information to trace it back. Let's look at some of the examples on the next slide related to identification and traceability requirements. So here are some of the examples which are listed here. One is labels and tag. Label and tag could basically tell that what particular product we have here. Let's say that if a company is having two types of pipes, one is a carbon steel pipe, one is a stainless steel pipe, or many other different type of pipes. So what they might even do is they might put a color coding on these pipes. That is also a part of identification, because using the color code on the pipe, you can clearly identify what type of pipe is this. In addition to that, you might use a tag on each of these pipes. You might put some label. It all depends on the scenario. It all depends on the circumstances, on the risks and opportunities. So you might have a different methods of identification and traceability. Another example of identification and traceability is barcode or QR code on these items, or you might even have serial numbers. Serial numbers will be mainly related to traceability. For example, if you are making car, then each car has a VIN number, which is a unique identification of each specific car. That is the traceability part. Traceability could also be in the terms of batch number. When a drug manufacturing company is making something, let's say they are making some pills, they are making cough syrup, so that will have a batch number. That is the traceability, because if something happens to that particular car, if something happens to that particular batch number, then the company should be able to easily recall that batch number or that particular vehicle. That is the traceability part. So depending on the circumstances, depending on the need, the company or the organization need to establish identification and traceability of the products. So this is 8.5.2. And remember that in 8.5, which is the product and service provision, we have 6 requirements. So we are at the second requirement here. The third requirement, which is 8.5.3, is property belonging to customers and external providers. Let's talk about that in the next video. In the clause 8.5, product and service provision, the next subclause is 8.5.3, property belonging to customers and external providers. So here let's take 2 examples. Let's say you are a payroll company which is doing payrolls for a specific customer. Now the customer will give you all the information related to their employees. That is the information which has been provided to your company by your customer. Let's take another example. In this example, let's say you are a fabrication company. And for doing this fabrication, your client gives you all the machinery, all the pieces of items which are used in the fabrication. So they give you pipes, they give you flanges, they give you equipment, and then your role is to do the fabrication of that. So in these 2 scenarios, what you received from your customer is something. In one case, you received information. In the second case, you received some physical products. These are customer properties. These need to be controlled. So this particular clause, which is 8.5.3, is related to the property belonging to the customer or external providers. Now, what are the requirements related to that? One thing is obvious, that as an organization, you will take care of the thing which is provided to you by your customer properly. So you will take a due care of that when it is under the control of this organization. And then you need to have identification, verification, and protection related to all the items, all the products, all the information which is provided to you. So let's say if you are the fabrication company and if your customer provides you pipes and flanges and equipment, you would need to inspect that to check that you received the right information. The pieces are not already broken, they don't have scratches, they are acceptable, because tomorrow if some damage happens to that equipment, that will become your responsibility. So when you receive information or material from your customer, you need to identify them, you need to verify, you need to protect that. And if there is any issue with that, then this needs to be reported back to your customer, that the equipment or the pipe or the flanges which you provided to us are damaged. Take a photograph of that, send it to your customer so that you can be clear that this damage is not because of you. Same thing happens in case of data as well. You need to protect the data which has been provided to you by your customer. For payrolls, you need to protect them. You need to verify that data, that this data is in good condition. So if there's any problem related to this information or the product which is supplied by the customer, you need to document that problem and you need to convey that problem to the customer. Now here are some of the examples. The example could be the material, components, tools or equipments which are provided by your customer, or this could be the intellectual property or the personal data which is provided by the customer, or customer might also give you a location to work on the premises which they provide to you, that you work in our office, you work at our location, that also is the customer property. So in summary, whatever product or information is provided by your customer, you check that, inspect that, and if there's any issue, you tell that to your customer and keep a document of that. So this is 8.5.3. Let's talk about the next one, which is the preservation, in the next video. So previously we talked about customer property, which was 8.5.3. Now the next one, which is 8.5.4, is preservation. So this is a very short requirement in the standard. I think there are just 2 lines related to preservation. What it says is, preserve the output during production and service provision to ensure conformity to requirements. Personally, I think that it's not just the output which we need to preserve. We need to preserve inputs as well. But let's just focus on the standard. So standard says that preserve the output. Preserve the output so that you maintain its characteristic. So whatever you are produced, you don't want to get it rusted. You don't want to get that obsolete. You don't want to get that contaminated. So you need to protect that, and that is done by preservation of your output. Now there are different aspects of preservations which are listed in the notes, which are identification and handling. So when you have made something, you need to have a clear identification of that. You need to properly handle that. You need to make sure that this doesn't get contaminated with some other things. It also talks about packaging and storage, so that the product which you have produced is good. And then it also talks about the transmission and transportation, so that the product doesn't get damaged during that. So all the protection which you need to take for the output is covered under this clause, and this clause is very simple. It says that preserve the output. So here are some of the examples of that when it comes to preserving the output. So when you are shipping this product to some other location, then the packaging material should be good, which should be able to protect this material during shipping. And you need to store the product under controlled conditions. Some product requires a specific temperature. Some product requires a certain humidity to be maintained. So you need to maintain them to preserve the product. And also you need to protect your product from contamination. So let's say the facility which you have is a gluten-free facility or a nut-free facility where the products are gluten-free or nut-free. In that case, you need to put some control in place to avoid any contamination. Another approach for preservation will be first in, first out. So the product which is produced first should be shipped out first. That way, you will avoid an old product being in your facility and getting obsolete. So these are the aspects related to preservation which you need to implement as a part of product and service provision. So with this, now we are left with two more sub clauses, 8.5.5 and 6. Let's talk about them in the next video. Welcome back. So we are at clause number 8.5, which is product and service provision. So basically in this clause, we are talking about actual production. And in this, previously we talked about preservation, which was 8.5.4. Now in this video, we will talk about balance two parts of 8.5. Now previously we talked about preservation, we talked about controls during manufacturing. Now once the product has been shipped out, once the product has been delivered, still there are some responsibilities which the organization has to take. And that's what is covered in 8.5.5, which is the post-delivery activities once the product has been delivered to the customer. Now what are those activities? Let's look at them. So here is the partial list of post-delivery activities and the balance are covered on the next slide. The first item here is statutory and regulatory requirements. In post-delivery, you need to consider that are there any statutory, regulatory or legal requirements? For example, let's say if there's any requirement related to environmental compliance through recycling program or any other requirement which is a legal requirement post-delivery, that also needed to be addressed here as a part of this clause. And the next post-delivery activity which is needed to be considered is the potential for undesirable consequences. So as a part of this, the organization is expected to assess and mitigate any potential negative outcome which is associated with the product or service. So example of this is offering customer support if something goes wrong with the product or maybe recalling that. So that also needs to be considered as a part of a post-delivery activity. And also as a part of post-delivery activities, organizations need to look at the nature, use and the lifetime of the product or service which they are offering. For example, they might need to offer a warranty, which is also a post-delivery activity, or a maintenance contract, or supplying consumables or accessories on ongoing basis. That is also to be considered as a part of post-delivery activities. The next one is customer requirements. So if there are some customer requirements which are needed to be met after delivery. For example, if you are hosting a website which has already been delivered to you, now there are some agreements which are service level agreements that company will meet this level of service. That also is a post-delivery activity which organization need to address. And then the last item in this list is customer feedback. So the customer feedback is needed to be integrated to improve the product or service. So for that, company might need to provide some platform, some way for customer to provide the feedback. So these are some of the activities which are related to the post-delivery once the product or service has been delivered. This was 8.5.5. And the last one here is 8.5.6, which is control of changes. So when you are providing the product or service, the changes are needed to be reviewed and controlled. And for that, the company is required to retain documented information, which tells that what changes were made to the product or service and what are the consequences of that, who has reviewed that. So that documentation is required to be kept. So this was 8.5.6. So with this, we completed 8.5. 8.5 was product and service provision, which was actually related to doing the job, making the product or providing the service. And we looked at 6 sub-clauses of that. Let's summarize this by looking at the key actions as a part of clause number 8.5. So initially we talked about having some controls on the production and service provisions. So all the production should be done in a controlled way, and we looked at various control mechanisms, which was in 8.5.1. And then we talked about identification and traceability that is needed to be maintained as necessary. And when the property or the item or the information is provided by the customer, that is also needed to be checked and maintained. And if there's any issue, that needed to be told to the customer. Outputs are needed to be preserved so that the conformity to the product is maintained. And then there are some post-delivery activities. We talked about them. Those are also needed. And then in the last, we talked about change control, that if you make any changes to the product or service, that documented information is needed to be maintained. And we need to make sure that the product or service still provide the required output. So with this, we complete 8.5, which is product and service provision. And now the next clause will be 8.6, which is release of products and services. Let's talk about that in the next video. Clause number 8 of the standard is a long clause, And you would have seen that we have covered that in so many videos. And now we are almost at the end of clause number 8. So now what we are left with are two subclauses, 8.6 and 8.7. Let's talk about 8.6 here. 8.6 is related to the release of products and services. So now we have produced that product or service. Now how do we release that? For releasing, we need to have some control. Somebody need to verify that. So that is first requirement, that conduct verification at appropriate stages to confirm that the requirements are being met. That is one part. Second part is authorizing the release of that. So there has to be a mechanism which tells that how a product or service will be released to the customer. Let's just focus on the product. So once the product has gone through the final inspection, somebody need to authorize that okay, now this product can go and be shipped to the customer. That is authorization of release. So that means the product should not be released. It should not be authorized to release until all the requirements which have been defined as a part of planning, as a part of all the things which you have doing so far, if those requirements have been met, then you can release this product to the customer. And then for releasing, the documented information need to be retained. So whatever checks, whatever inspections, whatever reviews you have done, you need to retain the documents related to that before you release that product to the customer. So that's a simple requirement. Basically, when you release, somebody needs to check, somebody needs to make sure that all the checks and balances which we planned have been met. Now here is the quick summary of 8.6, which tells that we need to establish verification process, that this is the verification process. Here at these stages we will have inspections. These are the acceptance criteria. So if all those inspections are okay, then the product could be released. And in addition to that, that means in addition to defining and implementing verification process, you need to have authorization process as well, which tells that who all are authorized to release this product or service. And then record of these are needed to be maintained. So these are the requirements which are addressed in 8.6, which is release of products and services. Now the next we will talk about 8.7, which is control of non-conforming outputs. Let's talk about that in the next video. The last subclause of clause number 8, operations, is 8.7, which is control of non-conforming outputs. We have talked so much about production controls. Now let's say if the output is not meeting requirements, what do we do? That is what is covered in 8.7, which is control of non-conforming output. So you produced something and now this item or this service is not meeting requirement. What do we need to do? First thing is identification and segregation. So you need to identify that this piece of a product, this car, this shaft, this gear, whatever we have produced, this does not meet the requirement. And you need to identify that. Now, how do you identify that? Probably you might put a red sticker on that this item is rejected or this item need to be reviewed. And then you need to segregate that so that by mistake that item doesn't get used. Now, once this has been identified and segregated, the next step will be evaluating and disposition. Now you have to decide whether we need to correct this or whether we need to reject this, or maybe this was provided by supplier, we will have to return that to supplier, or maybe we will have to stop the service which we were providing. So somebody needs to make that decision that what do we do with this non-conforming output related to the product or the service which we have been providing. If that doesn't meet the requirement, what do we need to do? And then this non-conformity is needed to be communicated to the right personnel, and this could also be external provider, that this particular thing does not meet requirement. Let's say if the item was provided by the supplier, you need to communicate this to the supplier that these pieces do not meet specification. So communication is another aspect. And then you need to retain documented information on the nature of non-conformity, what was wrong, and any subsequent action taken. And that includes that what decision you took on that. Did you decide to repair that, or did you decide to scrap that, or did you decide to send it back to the supplier? That also need to be documented. This is what is required as a part of 8.7. Let's summarize this here as a part of key actions which we need to take. One is you need to identify output which is non-conforming. Then you need to segregate that. You need to evaluate what actions are taken, and then it's not listed here specifically in the standard, but then you need to take some action to prevent the recurrence of that. But that part is covered in the clause 10.2, which we will be talking later on. You need to take some corrective action. The standard has not specifically asked for it here in 8.7, but I just thought that it will be right to talk about that. So if you find something wrong, you took some decision, you rejected that, you repaired that, but in addition to that, you might want to take some corrective action so that this problem does not happen again. And then it need to be communicated to the right people and needed to be documented. So with this, we complete the big clause in the standard, which is clause number 8, operation. First of all, let me congratulate you on completing clause 8 of the ISO 9001 standard. Completing that clause required a little bit more patience than other clauses. That was a long clause and had lot many requirements. But now that is done. Now coming to the clause number 9, which is performance evaluation. Once again, I will go to PDCA cycle. So performance evaluation or clause 9 falls under the check category. So we planned initially and then we did in clause number 7 and 8, we did the work, and now in clause number 9, we will check, and in clause number 10, we will act based on whatever check we have done. So this is the checking phase where we want to measure the performance and see whether we achieved our goal or not. Now this clause focuses on monitoring, measuring, analyzing and evaluating the quality management system to achieve continual improvement. In clause number 9, we have three sub clauses. 9.1, which we will be covering here, which is monitoring, measuring, analyzing and evaluating. And then 9.2 will be internal audits, and 9.3 will be management review, which we will talk later on. Let's focus on 9.1. So here is clause 9.1, monitoring, measuring, analyzing and evaluating. So in this clause, which is 9.1, there are three sub clauses. 9.1.1, which is a general clause. Then 9.1.2 is related to the customer satisfaction, monitoring customer satisfaction, and 9.1.3 is analyzing and evaluating data. Let's look at each of them. Let's start with the general clause. So here is the general clause. It says that we need to do some monitoring, some measurements, some analysis and some evaluation to check whether our quality management system is performing as expected or not. So in the general clause, it says that we need to define what are we going to monitor, measure, analyze and evaluate. So we need to determine the scope of these activities, scope of monitoring and measurement activities. And then we need to decide that how we are going to do that. What is the appropriate method for collecting data and analyzing data, and when we will be doing that, frequency, and what these things will be done. The monitoring, measuring, analysis and evaluation, when these will be done and what will be their frequency. So all these things we need to decide as a part of this particular subclause, and we need to retain documented information as the result of these evaluation. Whatever analysis, whatever evaluation, whatever measurements you do, you need to keep a record of that. That is 9.1.1. Now here we are talking about generally monitoring, measuring, analysis of data. This doesn't tell that what type of data need to be collected, what type of data needs to be analyzed. But one particular clause, which is this 9.1.2, specifically focuses on customer satisfaction. There is a lot of data to be analyzed, evaluated, but then standard specifically asks for customer satisfaction as one of the area for which you need to collect data, analyze data and take action based on that. So in this, you need to monitor that what is the customer perception of the quality of the product or service which you are offering, and to what degree their needs and requirements are being fulfilled. And for this, you need to use appropriate method for collecting data and analysis of that data which is related to the customer satisfaction. Now this method could be anything. This could be a typical customer feedback form, or this could be a survey, this could be market share analysis at a bigger level, or this could be the complaint data. So you need to collect the data related to customer satisfaction and analyze that. That is 9.1.2. Coming to the last piece of this, which is analysis and evaluation. So this part of the requirement, it asks for analysis of data and information which you have collected, which you have measured, and input for this analysis could be customer feedback. This could be the process performance, how your process is performing. That could be in the terms of yield, or maybe the cycle time, or maybe the takt time, or maybe the defect rate. And other areas from which you can get inputs are the product conformity, basically that's the defect rate, performance of external providers, that you will get based on how your suppliers are performing, what are their defect rate, what is the complaints, or what are the number of complaints related to the supplier items. And in addition to that, data could come from the actions taken to address the risks and opportunities which you have identified earlier. So there are various sources of data which you need to analyze and evaluate. The whole purpose of this is to ensure or to check whether your quality management system is serving the purpose for which this is being implemented, whether you are achieving the goal or not. Now here the standard also asks for considering the statistical techniques to analyze the data. Let's look at the key actions for clause 9.1 implementation. So this clause consists of three parts. The first part, which is general, that consisted of what are the areas from where the data will be coming, how frequently this will be coming, and what sort of analysis you will be doing. So that's the planning part, which was in the general clause. Then the standard specifically asks for client satisfaction or the customer satisfaction data. And the third part is analysis and evaluation of data to see the performance of quality management system, find the trend and drive continuous improvement. So this was clause number 9.1, which was monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation. And this was the part of clause number 9, which is performance evaluation. So now after covering 9.1, let's move on to 9.2, which is internal audit. Let's talk about that in the next video. In clause 9, which is performance evaluation, 9.2 is internal audits. ISO 9001:2015 asks organizations to establish and maintain internal audit program to verify QMS conformity and effectiveness, to check if the QMS or the quality management system is conforming to the requirement and whether that's effective or not. That is the purpose of internal audits. Now let's look at the requirements in 9.2. Here is the purpose of 9.2, which says that conduct internal audits to provide information on the quality management system. Why do we conduct internal audit? To check whether our quality management system performs or meets the requirements or not. Now, where are the requirements coming from? Requirements are coming from ISO 9001 and also from within the organization. So some of the requirements in the quality management system could be specifically from 9001, and some of the requirements could be based on company's own experience, company's own knowledge. So those could be company specific requirements. Internal audit looks at both of these aspects to check whether the quality management system is implemented effectively or not. One is the implementation, second is whether this is effective or not, whether this is giving the results or not. Now, the second part of this clause explains more details about internal audits, that what is expected as per 9001. So 9001 requires that organizations will plan, establish, implement and maintain an audit program. In the audit program, they will include what will be the frequency, what will be the method, responsibilities, planned requirements and reporting. And for each audit, the audit criteria and scope is required to be defined, that this audit is based on what criteria and what is the scope, what is covered in this audit and what is not covered in this audit. That is needed to be defined for each audit. Regarding auditor selection, ISO does not talk about the qualification of auditors. What ISO 9000 specifically asks for is that the auditor who are conducting audit, they should be objective and impartial of the process being audited. But then, as I earlier said, companies might have their own requirements, and many companies do have requirements related to auditor qualification and auditor training. But ISO 9001 as a standard does not specifically talk about auditors qualification and auditors training. Now coming to audit results, ISO 9001 says that the audit results will be reported to the relevant management and appropriate actions will be taken without undue delay. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't say that all the actions which are identified in the audit must be taken in 7 days or 30 days or 60 days. It does not say that, because many actions might take more time. So when you have an audit finding, you might have to do some correction, and then you might have to do the root cause analysis. You might have to take actions to eliminate the cause of the problem. So those might take time. So for that reason, ISO does not put a time limit on that. The only requirement is that it should not be having undue delay in the process of resolving these non-conformities. And then it requires that the documented information is needed to be retained for audit program and audit results. So whatever audit findings are there, whatever is audit report, that is needed to be retained as a part of evidence that audit program was being implemented in the organization. So these are requirements related to internal audit in clause number 9.2. Let's summarize this as a part of key actions for clause 9.2 implementation. One is that organizations need to have an internal audit program. For each audit, they need to have a clearly defined criteria and scope. And each audit should be done by an auditor who is objective and impartial. That means this person should not be from the same work area which is being audited, because that will be the conflict of interest. So in most cases, in many companies, these auditors are taken from a different department, different function or different location, so that they do not have conflict of interest in the area being audited. And then audit need to be reported and necessary action is needed to be taken in a timely fashion. And all these things need to be documented as a proof that the audit program is being implemented in the organization. So these are requirements related to 9.2. Now with that, the next item in clause number 9, which is performance evaluation, is management review. Let's talk about that in the next video. So in clause number 9, which is performance evaluation, previously we talked about 9.1, which was monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation. Then we talked about 9.2, which was internal audit. Now coming to 9.3, which is management review. Previously also we said that ISO 9001 emphasizes the involvement of leadership in the quality management system. And that's what this particular clause also focuses on. This focuses on the involvement of management in reviewing the quality management system at a periodical interval and see that whether the quality management system is effective or not. Are we meeting our goals or not? Do we need some additional resources? Are there any issues which require support from management? And that's what is done in management review. Now this particular clause, which is 9.3, has 3 sub clauses. 9.3.1, which is general. 9.3.2 is inputs to the management review, and 9.3.3 is outputs of the management review. Let's look at the first part of that, which is 9.3.1, which is a general clause. It says that the management review shall be conducted at planned interval. Now what is this planned interval? This could be monthly, this could be every 6 months, or this could be every year, depending upon the company. But in real practicality, most of the companies do that once in a year. So once in a year, management review is done, where typically a quality manager or quality director presents all the inputs to the management, explains them the situation of the quality management system, and based on that meeting, some recommendations are made, some support is asked from the management, and that becomes the management review output. Now the focus here is to see whether the quality management system is continuing to be suitable for the job. Is it adequate? Is it effective? And is it aligned with the strategic direction of the organization? Basically, we are reviewing the quality management system to check whether it is serving the purpose or not. That's 9.3.1. 9.3.2 is inputs to the management review. Now, what are the inputs? What are the preparations which this quality manager has to do? Who presents these inputs to the management? Now, here is the list. And once again, when I say quality manager or quality director has to present, ISO does not talk about that. ISO does not say that who will be providing inputs and who will be reviewing that. What I'm talking about is a general industry practice where the quality manager or quality director collects all this data and presents it to the management. Let's come back to the topic. Now, inputs here are the follow-up action from the previous management review. Since this is done every year, so first thing you might want to review in this meeting is that what did we decide last year or in the previous meeting and what actions have been taken. And then other inputs include internal and external changes which could affect the quality management system, change in the market condition, change in the product design, whatever changes have happened internally or externally, maybe the management change, those are discussed here. Then the quality objective performance. We did talk about quality policy and quality objectives. So there are quality objectives defined for different areas, different functions. So those are analyzed here, that these were our quality objectives and where do we stand, what is their performance. This also includes the process performance and the product conformity, how the processes are working, what is the defect level, what is the rejection rate, what is the return rate, all those things related to the performance of the processes, and then status of corrective and preventive actions which have been identified, let's say in all the internal audits or also external audits. So those are also reviewed. Monitoring and measuring results. We did talk about monitoring and measuring earlier. So the result of that is also analyzed. Results of audits, customer feedback, customer complaints, adequacy of resources needed, and actions taken for identified risks and opportunities, and if there are any recommendation for improvement. So these are some of the typical lists of items which become the input for management review. Depending on the organization, you can have more or less from this list which become the input for the management review. Now these are the inputs, and then you have the meeting with the management and you look at each of these. Discussion is held based on whether these are meeting the objective of the company or not, and then you have a management review output. Now here are the outputs which are suggested by the standard, ISO 9001 standard. One important output of this meeting will be decisions and actions to be taken in regards to the opportunities for improvement, any changes to the quality management system, or any additional resources needed. So those are the outputs of this meeting. Because remember that here we are having meeting with the management where we are presenting these inputs to the management, and based on that some appropriate actions are decided, that this is what we are going to change next year, these are the additional people, these are the additional resources, and these are the opportunities for improvement. Maybe in these areas we might need to do additional root cause analysis, we might need to do some additional Six Sigma projects for improvement. So all those things become the output of management review. And standard requires to retain documented information as an evidence of the results of management review, and these output of management review become the inputs for the next management review meeting. So whatever we have decided, let's say this year, next year we will review them again and see whether those things have been done or if there is any change to that. Now let's summarize 9.3 here, which are the key actions for clause number 9.3 implementation, which is the management review clause. First thing is that you have a periodic management review which is planned and conducted at a regular interval. There are different types of inputs which are required for this meeting, and based on that the decisions which are taken by management become the output of management review meeting. And then those actions which are identified as an output, you need to do some follow-up, and then accountability is fixed for taking those actions. And here the focus is on improvement, finding out the areas where things could be improved, where things could be changed, where extra people could be put. So this was clause number 9.3, which is management review. Now with this we are left with one more main clause, and that clause is clause number 10, improvement. Let's talk about that starting from the next video. Previously, we covered clause number 9, which was performance evaluation. And if we look at the PDCA cycle, the performance evaluation will fall under the check component of PDCA. So after checking, where we look at the gap between what is expected and what is the actual performance, the next step in the PDCA cycle is act on those findings. And this is what is covered in clause number 10 of ISO 9001. Clause number 10 is improvement. Clause number 10 has been subdivided into three parts. The first part is general, which we will be covering in this video. And then 10.2 covers the non-conformity and corrective action, and 10.3 is on continual improvement. Let's focus on 10.1, which is general clause related to improvement. So this clause requires organizations to determine and select opportunities for improvement. So find out where improvement can be done and implement necessary action. And now what is the purpose of that? Purpose of that is meeting customer requirements and enhancing customer satisfaction. That's what is the purpose of continual improvement. Now, three areas have been specifically listed in the standard, and these areas of improvement are improving the product or service to meet the customer requirements, maybe make your product or service better. That's one part of improvement. Second part of improvement is correcting, preventing, or reducing undesirable effects. So this could be customer complaints, addressing those, addressing the number of defects which you are getting, addressing anything which is leading to client dissatisfaction. So taking correction on that and preventing them from happening again and again, and reducing the bad effect of non-conformities or the problems. That is the second area of improvement. And the third area of improvement is improving the performance and effectiveness of the quality management system in general. Like how do you improve or make quality management system better? So these are the areas of improvements suggested by ISO 9001. So here we talked about finding out the opportunities for improvement and taking actions. Now on the next slide, let's talk about what are the methods, typical methods of identifying improvement opportunities, which is here. Now, to identify improvement opportunities, one thing could be data analysis. Each company has huge amount of data related to production, data related to client service, data related to client satisfaction, and so on. So there is a huge data in every organization. So analysis of that could lead to some opportunities being identified for improvement. Another one is customer feedback. So taking feedback from customer rating, or maybe talking to client, that could lead to identifying some areas of improvement. Another one is internal and external audits. Standard talks about internal audits to find out the opportunities for improvement, but external audits could also give you some areas where improvement can be made. And then management review, of course, we talked about that. That is used to find out where improvement can be done, where additional resources can be put so that we can improve our quality management system or our product or service. And another one is non-conformity and corrective action reports. These non-conformities could come from internal, external audits. These could come from client. So whatever non-conformities are identified, you might need to go into the root cause of these non-conformities and decide on the corrective action. So these are some of the areas which could lead to identifying opportunities for improvement. So let's quickly wrap up 10.1, which is a general clause in improvement. So first thing here is focus on continual improvement. Find various methods to find the opportunities for improvement. This could be doing data analysis, customer feedback, audit, management review, or any other way. Find out the opportunities for improvement, plan to take action, assign responsibility, and monitor those actions, whether these are leading to improvement or not. That is clause number 10.1. Now 10.2, which we will be talking next, is non-conformity and corrective action. Let's talk about that in the next video. In clause number 10, improvement, 10.1 was a general clause. Now coming to 10.2, which is non-conformity and corrective action. Now what is a non-conformity? Non-conformity is when there is a gap between what is expected and what's actually there. So if the actual situation does not match with what is expected, that is a non-conformity. Non-conformity could be related to the product not meeting specification, or non-conformity could be related to the process is not following the way it should have been done. Now, what are the actions which we need to take when a non-conformity is identified? That's what 10.2 is talking about. So when the non-conformity happens, the first thing organization need to do is respond to the non-conformity. And when you say respond to the non-conformity, that means take necessary action to control that or correct that. And second thing would be to deal with the consequences of that non-conformity. So this part is the correction part. Take action to correct the situation. That is one part of non-conformity. Other part of non-conformity is the corrective actions. So corrective actions are those actions which will eliminate the cause of the problem and which will prevent the recurrence of the problem. So if you remove the root cause of the problem will not happen again. Also, problem will not happen at some other place. So all those actions which are done for this type of scenario, where you are taking action to eliminate that problem from happening again or happening in the other place, that is called as the corrective action. Now for this, you need to review and analyze the non-conformity, determine the causes of the non-conformity, find out the root cause of the non-conformity, and also determine if the similar sort of a problem is happening in some other places, or if there's any potential of this type of problem happening in some other place. So that is the investigation part. And then you need to take some action to remove those causes, those root causes, so that the problem does not happen again and also does not happen in some other place as well. So that is corrective action. In addition to that, this clause also requires that the organization shall look into the effectiveness of the corrective action. You have done the root cause analysis, you have found the cause of the problem, you have taken action, and you have thought that this problem will not happen again. But was that corrective action effective or not? That also is required to be determined. And with this, you might also want to update the risk and opportunities identified if you have done that earlier, if necessary, and update the quality management system if necessary. So that is the corrective action part, to eliminate the problem permanently. Now coming to some other requirements, these are related to retaining documented information. So when there are non-conformities, when you are taking corrective actions, then the standard requires that you retain documented information as an evidence that what was the nature of the non-conformity and what were the actions taken and what was the result of the corrective action. So this is clause number 10.2, non-conformity and corrective action. let's quickly wrap it up with the key actions. So first thing is we need to identify non-conformities. These could be identified by audit, internal and external. These could be identified by, let's say, customer complaints or some other way. So you identify non-conformity, you analyze and investigate them, find out the root cause of the problem, take corrective actions, and review the effectiveness of those corrective actions, and maintain a record of all these actions which you have taken here as a part of identifying non-conformity and taking corrective actions. That's clause number 10.2, non-conformity and corrective actions. Now we are left with one more subclause, which is 10.3, continual improvement. Let's talk about that in the next video. In clause number 10, which was improvement, we have talked about 10.1 and 10.2. Now coming to 10.3, which is the last subclause of ISO 9001:2015 standard. And 10.3 is continual improvement. This requires that organizations will continually improve. Improve what? Improve the suitability of the quality management system. If it is not suitable, make some changes, improve that. Adequacy of the quality management system. If your quality management system is not adequate, make some adjustment and make it more adequate for the purpose this quality management system was set up, and make it more effective. So these are the three aspects of continual improvement: suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. Now, what are the approaches for improvement? Improvement can be done through analysis of data and trend. We have talked a lot earlier about data. So you analyze data, you look at the trends, and based on that, you might want to improve your processes or product. In addition to that, other approach could be implementing improvement actions. So these improvement actions could be related to the product, process, or service. These might have been identified based on the customer feedback, market feedback, or your internal feedback. And another one is evaluate the result of that. So whatever improvements you are making, you need to regularly evaluate the result, whether these are achieving the objective or not. So this is continual improvement, which is clause number 10.3. A quick wrap up of this subclause. First thing is you need to identify improvement opportunities. Then you need to plan and prioritize those. There is a possibility that you might identify, let's say, 50 improvement opportunities, but then you cannot work on everything. So you might have to prioritize and plan. And in planning, you might have to assign responsibility. You might have to assign the target date of making that change. So that's the planning part. And then you implement those improvements. Once you implement them, then you need to monitor and review whether those are really making some changes to the product or processes. And in the end, companies need to have a culture of improvement. Organizations need to encourage everyone in the organization to continually improve whatever work or processes they are performing. So this is clause number 10.3. With this, we complete the detailed discussion on clause by clause, subclause by subclause, ISO 9001 standard. Now I know this was a long discussion, but prior to this, in section 2, we did talk about a quick overview, and then in section 3, we went into much more detail where we look at the standard in much more detail. And before we conclude this course, let's quickly recap all the major requirements or the major clauses in ISO 9001 standard. So let's have that in the next video. So in this section, previously we looked at clause by clause, subclause by subclause explanation of ISO 9001:2015 version. Now what we will do in this video is quickly recap what we have learned. We will look at some steps which companies need to take when implementing ISO 9001, and with this we will conclude this course. So here is the quick recap of all the clauses of ISO 9001. So what I've done is I have not added clause number 1, 2, and 3 because there were not specific actions which organizations are required to take. So I have eliminated clause number 1, 2, and 3. In clause number 4, we talked about the context of the organization. Here we looked at the internal and external factors. We looked at the needs and expectations of interested parties, and we decided on the scope of quality management system. That's what we did in clause number 4. In clause number 5, we talked about leadership. Here we talked about customer focus. We talked about quality policy, and we talked about organizational roles and responsibilities. Coming to clause number 6, which is planning. Here we talk about identifying risks and opportunities, and that's where the risk-based thinking concept was introduced. And then here we set up some objectives, and these objectives were based on the quality policy, and we also talked about planning for changes. So this clause, which is clause number 6, planning, was focused on the planning for the quality management system. And then in clause number 7, we talked about support. Here we talked about number of things, many types of resources we talked about competence of people, we talked about awareness, communication, and documented information. And in documented information, we did talk about the difference between maintaining documented information and retaining documented information. Clause number 8 was operations, which was a very big clause. There are a lot of sub clauses and sub clauses in that, because this clause operation covers the actual work the organization is doing. In clause number 9, we talked about performance evaluation. Here we talked about monitoring, measuring, analyzing, and evaluating the quality management system. And in the clause number 10, which is improvement, we talked about continual improvement to improve the performance of the organization. So these are the 10 clauses in ISO 9001:2015. Now here are some thoughts on implementing ISO 9001. So if a company has to implement 9001, how do they start with that? I'm not going into the details of that. So this is just a quick overview. When you want to implement ISO 9001 standard, the first thing is the commitment of leadership. And the next thing is employee engagement. Here you want to involve employees into the quality management system and foster a culture of quality improvement. Clear documentation is another important aspect of 9001 standard. So when you implement 9001, many things need to be documented. And this is a significant effort. So if a company is not certified to 9001, if they do not have much of the processes documented, then this could be a significant effort for the company to implement ISO 9001. Regular training is another important aspect of implementing ISO 9001 standard. A course like this could help people understand what are the requirements related to ISO 9001 for the work what they are doing. That will help them in documenting those processes. And once you implement, or once you are in the process of implementing ISO 9001 standard, there is a need to continually monitor whether the processes are being followed, and that could be done using internal audits. And effective communication is another important aspect in implementing ISO 9001. So these are some quick thoughts on implementing 9001 successfully. So now here are some final thoughts from me before we wrap up this course. ISO 9001 is a great, powerful tool to drive quality into an organization. It could lead the company to excellence. But this is a beginning. There is a lot much to do even after implementing ISO 9001, but this could be a great beginning for company to move towards the excellence. This is an ongoing journey. So it's not that once you implement ISO 9001, everything will be great. So this is an ongoing journey of continual improvement. And that's what we covered in clause number 10 as well. So if your company is looking for improving performance, doing things better, improving the quality, improving the customer satisfaction, ISO 9001 is a good way to start that journey. So with this, I conclude this section 3, and also I conclude this course. I hope the information which you gained here was useful for you to implement ISO 9001 standard in your organization and improve the processes, whatever you are doing. With this, thank you so much and wish you a great success in your journey towards quality.